I searched for you for years. Annie's voice rang through the vast conference room, cold as a blade freshly drawn from its sheath. Finally, today, I found you. The entire room fell silent. Richard Whitmore, the man seated at the head of the long table, shoved his chair back and stood up so abruptly that the leather chair scraped harshly across the floor. The sharp sound made several people flinch and turn. Every executive in the room looked toward the door. 2 security guards standing near the glass wall immediately stepped forward. "What the hell is this?" Richard snapped. "You found me? For what?" He turned sharply toward his staff, his face tense. "Who is this girl? Who let her in here?" No one answered. Annie walked straight into the room, as if she needed no one's permission. Behind Richard, the large screen was still displaying the presentation for his latest public development project. The glowing words on the screen felt almost cruel in their irony. Safety, community, progress. Malcolm Pierce, Richard's chief legal counsel, slowly rose from his seat. "Miss," he said in a controlled voice, "you need to leave right now." Annie did not even glance at him. She kept walking, each step slow but steady, until she stopped beside the long conference table. Then she placed a worn stack of cash on the polished surface. No, she did not place it. She threw it down in front of Richard. The rubber band around the stack snapped. Old bills scattered across the table, sliding over folders, coffee cups, expensive pens, and the hands of men who quickly pulled away. Richard looked down at the money spread out before him. "What the hell is this?" Annie clenched her jaw. "You don't recognize this either?" Richard blinked again and again. For a moment, everything on his face seemed to blur. He looked at the bills, then at Annie, then back down at the money. "I don't know who you are," he said. "But if this is some cheap little stunt, you picked the wrong building." Annie planted both hands on the table. Her voice did not grow louder, but it hardened so much that even Malcolm stopped moving. "You really don't recognize me?" she asked. "Look carefully, Mr. Whitmore. Are you sure you don't recognize me?" Richard's eyelid twitched. He rubbed his eyes, irritation spreading across his face, as if he were angry at himself because something in his memory was trying to surface. "Who are you?" Annie looked directly into his eyes. For a moment, the whole room seemed to stop breathing. Then the memory came rushing back. First, the eyes, then the shape of her mouth, then that quiet, stubborn, painfully firm way she stood in front of him. A temporary construction trailer flashed through Richard's mind. The suffocating heat, cement dust clinging to the windows, a yellow hard hat lying on the table, and a black engineer standing across from him 6 years earlier, refusing to sign the report that declared the site safe. Samuel Carter. Richard's face went pale. He took half a step back and had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. "No," he muttered. Annie did not move. Richard blinked again, harder this time. He looked almost angry that he had remembered. Then his voice broke out, filled with shock and panic. "You're his daughter," Richard said. "You're the daughter of that engineer who worked for me 6 years ago." Several people around the table turned to look at him. Malcolm's face immediately went rigid. Annie gave a small nod. "Now you remember." Richard's breathing grew faster. He pressed his palms against the table, trying to keep his composure. His heart was pounding, and he hated that feeling. But then Richard's expression changed. Fear slipped behind pride. The corner of his mouth twisted into a short, dry, bitter smile. "So this is Samuel Carter's daughter," he said. Annie's eyes narrowed. Richard glanced down at the bills scattered across the table, then laughed. This time, the laugh was louder, as if he had just regained control of the room. "What's wrong? The settlement money wasn't enough?" he asked. "Is that why you dragged yourself in here today? Your family received compensation after that accident." "Here." "Compensation? A settlement?" Annie asked. "That's right," Richard said. "And if I remember correctly, your father's carelessness caused a serious workplace accident. My company did more than the law required for your family." The air in the room grew thick. Richard pointed at the money. "Go on. How much more do you want? Is that why you crawled all the way here today? To beg for more?" Annie stared at him for a long moment. Then she slowly pointed down at the bills on the table. "Look carefully," she said. "That is your dirty money." Richard's face changed at once. Annie's voice sharpened, each word falling like stone. "That is the same money your people brought to my mother after my father died." The same money she kept in a tin box for 6 years because she said spending it would feel like eating from her husband's grave. "That's enough," Malcolm warned quietly. But Annie was not speaking to Malcolm. "That money didn't save my mother from the nights she sat alone in the kitchen crying," she continued. "It didn't buy back my father's honor. It didn't stop people from whispering that Samuel Carter had been careless. And it didn't stop a little girl from growing up in shame, hearing people say her father had hurt others, when the truth was, he was trying to save them." Richard's jaw tightened. "You're insane." Annie took another step forward. "No, I'm the first person in 6 years brave enough to walk into this room and tell the truth." Richard slammed his hand down on the table. Coffee cups rattled. A city official sitting nearby stiffened. A few bills lifted from the table and drifted back down. "You're insane," Richard roared. "You barge into my office, throw money on my table, accuse me in front of my board, and expect me to stand here and listen to your little performance?" Annie's eyes never left his face. Richard whipped around toward the door. "Security, get her out of here now." The two guards immediately moved forward. Annie did not step back. She lifted her chin and looked Richard straight in the eye. "You used falsified records to corner my father," she said. "You took the report he submitted, reversed the timeline, and made him look reckless. Then, after he died, you used dirty money to silence my family." Richard's face flushed red. He slammed his hand down on the table again, then waved toward the guards. "Enough," he bellowed. "Do not stand in my conference room and smear my reputation. If your father was wrong, then he paid the price for his mistake. The legal record was closed. Years ago." He leaned forward. His voice dropped, colder now. "Do you understand? One phone call. That's all it takes. One phone call. And I can have you arrested for defamation, trespassing, harassment, or whatever charge my attorney thinks fits best. You think you can just walk in here and threaten me?" Annie looked at the men seated around the table. Then she looked back at Richard. "I think you just showed everyone exactly what kind of man my father was up against." Malcolm cut in immediately. "Mr. Whitmore, stop talking." Richard ignored him. His breathing grew heavier. He remained standing there, one hand pressed against the table, the other hovering in the air as if one command from him could make the entire room forget everything it had just heard. Annie reached into the brown envelope she was carrying. Malcolm's eyes locked instantly on her hand. "Don't." Annie pulled out a small USB drive. Richard stared at it. "What is that?" Annie held the USB drive between two fingers. "The part of my father's truth that you couldn't bury with him." For the first time, Richard had no words. The two security guards froze. Malcolm's face tightened like a drawn wire. The board members stared at the tiny USB drive as if it were not a storage device at all, but a bomb counting down in the middle of the room. Annie turned and walked toward the large screen. And this time, no one moved fast enough to stop her. Richard Whitmore's hand was still resting on the tabletop, but every bit of strength in his body seemed to have drained away. For a few seconds, no one said a word. The USB drive in Annie's hand was so small it almost looked meaningless. And yet, at that moment, every eye in the room was fixed on it. Richard's face had changed. The anger was still there, but beneath it, something else had risen. Something faster, colder, and completely unwanted. He looked at Annie, then swallowed hard. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice had grown much quieter. Annie did not answer right away. She let the question hang in the room, allowing Richard to hear the weakness in his own voice. Malcolm Pierce stood close beside Richard, his eyes locked on the USB drive. "Miss Carter," Malcolm said, trying to gather what little composure he had left, "whatever you think you have in your possession, this is not the way to handle it." Annie turned to look at him. "You had 6 years to handle this." "That is enough," Malcolm said. "No," Annie replied. "Enough was when my father warned you. Enough was when your company took his report, twisted it, buried it, and attached his name to a disaster he had tried to prevent." Richard pressed his lips tightly together. "You keep saying things you cannot prove." Annie looked straight at him. "That's what you've been telling yourself all these years, isn't it? That if the file disappeared, the truth disappeared with it." She walked toward the far end of the table, where several reporters and city communications staff sat in silence. A security guard started to step forward to stop her, but at that moment, a board member, an older woman with silver hair and a calm face, spoke softly. "Wait." Malcolm snapped his head toward her. "Mrs. Caldwell, I strongly advise you to—" "I said wait," she repeated, her eyes still on Annie. Annie plugged the USB drive into the computer. For a moment, the large screen behind Richard went black. Then a folder appeared. Inside were dates, file names, old project codes, scanned documents, and a video file near the bottom of the list. Annie was in no hurry. Every movement she made was slow and careful. That calmness only made Richard look worse. He was breathing through his nose now, so heavily that the man seated beside him could hear it. "Annie," Malcolm said, his voice suddenly softer, but it was already too late. "Think about your mother. Think about how this will affect her." Annie's hand stopped on the keyboard. Slowly, she turned her head to look at him. "My mother has had to live with the consequences of what you did every day since my father died," she said. "Do not ever use her pain to protect yourselves." Then she clicked the file. The screen flickered. At first, the image was slightly blurry, the angle crooked, as if the camera had been set down in a hurry and forgotten. A conference room appeared. Not this room, but an older one, with construction drawings pinned across the walls. The date in the corner of the screen was from 6 years earlier. Richard's face turned white. Malcolm whispered, "No." The audio crackled for a few seconds, then slowly became clear. Then Richard Whitmore's voice filled the room. "Keep pushing the construction schedule forward. We are not letting Carter's objections slow this project down." Someone off camera spoke. "He submitted an official safety report. If something happens, that report will become a problem." Richard's voice came again, sharper this time. "Then make sure it is no longer a problem. Samuel Carter wants to stand in my way. Build a file on him. Turn this into his negligence. Make it look like he failed to do his job, and wipe every trace of that safety report from our system." No one moved. The video continued for a few more seconds. Then a younger version of Malcolm's voice came through, steady, precise, and cold. "We can reclassify the report as an informal note. If we adjust the inspection timeline, it will appear as though Mr. Carter signed off before the incident occurred." Richard answered shortly, "Do it." Annie stopped the video. One of the board members whispered, "Me God." The city official, who had been silent since Annie entered, slowly removed his glasses. His face hardened. It was the face of a man who had just realized that staying silent might no longer keep him clean. Richard stared at the screen. His own voice had done what Annie's accusations alone could not. It had stepped out of the past, stood right beside him, and left him nowhere to hide. "That recording has been edited," Malcolm said quickly. "No one in this room should draw conclusions from an unverified tape brought in by someone who entered this building without authorization." Annie clicked again. A scanned document appeared on the screen. It was Samuel Carter's original safety report. His signature was at the bottom. The warnings were clearly marked: risk of overload on the eastern scaffolding, mismatched steel bracing system, recommendation to halt construction immediately. "This is my father's report," Annie said. "The report you all claimed never existed." Another click. A receipt appeared. "And this proves that your project office received it 3 weeks before the collapse." One more click. A second report appeared. It looked almost identical in format to the first, but all the important sections were missing. "This is the version the investigators were given after the accident." She looked at Richard, not Malcolm. "You did not just ignore my father. You erased him." Richard finally spoke, but his voice was hoarse. "You have no idea how much pressure that project was under." Annie's eyes turned cold. The men on that site were the ones working under real pressure. "My father was only trying to keep them alive." "You think business is simple?" Richard snapped, trying to pull his old anger back. "You think a company this size can stop every time one employee panics?" "My father did not panic," Annie said. "He reported danger because there was danger. He questioned every decision that was put in front of him. He was doing his job. He cost us millions of dollars. And you cost him his honor." That silenced him. Annie pointed down at the bills still scattered across the table. "After he broke under what you did to him, after he got sick, after he died while the world still believed he was to blame, you sent this money to my mother. Not an apology. Not the truth. Just dirty money and a piece of paper telling her to stay quiet." Richard's eyes flicked down toward the cash. "My mother kept it in a tin box," Annie continued. "She said the money felt cursed. She said every dollar was a reminder that someone had put a price on my father's life and his dignity. If this moment touched your heart, please like this video, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about truth, justice, and the courage to stand up when it matters most. Malcolm stepped closer to the table. This meeting ends here. Attorneys will review the recording. Until then, no one says another word. Mrs. Caldwell turned to him. Were you in that recording, Malcolm? He did not answer. She looked at Richard. And were you? Richard's face twitched, but no words came out. For years, he had trusted distance. Distance from the construction site, distance from the workers, distance from the widow, distance from the little girl who had been too young to defend her father. He had trusted paperwork, lawyers, settlement agreements, and headlines that lasted for 1 week before disappearing. But today, that distance had betrayed him. The little girl from years ago had grown up. The widow had kept the money, and the dead man had left behind a voice. Annie opened the final file on the screen. It was a photograph of Samuel Carter in his work safety gear, standing beside an unfinished steel frame, one hand resting on his hard hat. His face was serious and tired, but his eyes were still full of life. "This is the man you turned into a lie," Annie said. Richard looked at the photograph, and for the first time since Annie had entered the room, he did not turn away because he was angry. He turned away because he could not bear those eyes. Annie closed the brown envelope and stood a little straighter. "I did not come here to ask for more money," she said. "I came because my father told the truth, and you made the world remember him as a careless black man who failed. Today, that ends." Richard slowly sat down, not because he had calmed down, but because his legs no longer had enough strength to hold him up. Annie looked one last time at the money scattered across the table. "Keep your money, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "I brought it back because my family does not want to carry anything that belongs to you anymore." The first thing Richard noticed was that no one was looking at him the way they had looked at him 10 minutes earlier. Before Annie Carter entered the room, every face around the table had belonged to his world. Investors watched him for signals. Board members waited for his judgment. City officials measured their words before handing them to him. Malcolm Pierce handled trouble before it reached the surface. That was how power worked when it was healthy. It moved quietly. It made others adjust. Now the room had stopped adjusting. Samuel Carter's photograph remained on the screen behind him. Not as evidence anymore, not only that, as presence. The man Richard had renamed, reduced, and pushed into an old file had returned with a face, a voice, and a daughter who had brought his name back into the building. Mrs. Caldwell was the first to speak. "Richard," she said, not loudly, "is that recording authentic?" Malcolm answered before Richard could. "No one should respond to that. This is an unlawful intrusion, and we are dealing with stolen corporate material." Annie turned to him. "You keep calling it stolen because you can't call it false." Malcolm's eyes hardened. "You have no idea what you've done." "I know exactly what I've done." "No," he said, stepping closer. "You have exposed yourself to civil and criminal liability. You entered private property, disrupted a board meeting, broadcast confidential materials, and made public accusations without legal verification." Annie gave a small nod toward the screen. "Then verify them." The room went still again. Richard's hand closed around the armrest of his chair. He wanted Malcolm to stop speaking, but he also needed him to continue. That had always been Malcolm's purpose, to place words between Richard and consequence. Still, the more Malcolm talked, the worse the room felt. One of the investors, a retired banker named Harold Finch, pushed his chair back slightly. Harold had known Richard for 20 years, had attended his Christmas dinners, had stood beside him at ribbon cuttings, had once told a reporter that Richard Whitmore built with a sense of moral architecture. Now he looked at the money on the table and said, "Were we given that report 6 years ago?" Malcolm turned. "Harold, this is not the appropriate." "I asked Richard." All eyes shifted. Richard hated them for it. That was his first honest feeling. Not shame, not regret. Hatred for the sudden expectation that he answer like an ordinary man. He looked at Annie instead. "Who helped you?" She did not answer. "You didn't get all this by yourself," he said. "Someone gave you access." Annie's face did not change. "My father gave me enough to start." "Your father is dead, and still more honest than anyone in this room who knew." A sharp breath came from somewhere near the wall. It might have been one of the assistants. It might have been a young project manager who had been taking notes until the recording played. Richard did not look. Malcolm moved toward Annie again. Hand over the drive. No. Miss Carter. No, she repeated, and this time her voice carried more weight than volume. You don't get to take the evidence into another room and make it disappear the way you did with my father's report. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Security. The guards hesitated. One of them, a broad man in a dark suit, looked at Richard. Richard lifted his hand, then stopped. The phone in Annie's other hand was still recording, and he had no idea how many people were watching or how much had already been saved. The old rules were not working. Every instinct told him to end the scene, but every possible ending seemed to create another scene outside the room. Mrs. Caldwell stood. No one touches her. Malcolm turned on her. You are exposing this company to catastrophic risk. She looked at him with the tired patience of someone who had raised children and buried a husband, and knew the difference between risk and rot. If that recording is real, the catastrophe happened 6 years ago. We are only late in admitting it. Harold Finch looked down at the printed agenda in front of him, then closed it. I want outside counsel. We have counsel, Malcolm said. No, Harold replied. We have you. The sentence landed harder than he intended. Malcolm's face lost its polish. Richard finally spoke. Everyone calm down. Annie looked at him. That's what you said then too, isn't it? When my father warned you, calm down. Keep moving. Don't let one man slow the project. Richard stood again, slower this time. You don't know what that project meant. I know what it cost. You know your family's side. My family's side? Annie repeated. She almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. My family got buried under your side. Richard pointed toward the screen. That building was tied to hundreds of jobs, city contracts, financing deadlines, community commitments. You think a pause was simple? My father asked for an inspection. He wanted to shut down a major project. He wanted men to go home alive. They did go home alive. Richard snapped, then stopped, because even he heard how ugly it sounded. Annie's eyes narrowed. 4 men left in ambulances. Richard's nostrils flared. And your father was responsible for safety. My father reported the danger. According to documents you brought into my office like some kind of street performance. According to your voice, Annie said. Silence returned. Richard looked at the screen again. Samuel's photograph remained. He remembered the man now more clearly than he wanted to. Samuel had not been loud. That was what bothered him. He had not shouted or threatened or tried to embarrass Richard in front of donors. He had simply refused to sign. At the time, Richard had taken that refusal as arrogance. A black engineer from the payroll looking him in the eye and saying no in a room where men with more expensive degrees had learned to say yes. Richard did not like where that thought led, so he pushed it away. Malcolm leaned close and spoke under his breath. We need to clear the room. Annie heard enough. That's what you do, isn't it? Clear rooms, close files, move people out of the way. Malcolm straightened. I am warning you for the last time. No, Mr. Pierce, I'm warning you. Annie touched her phone screen and turned it so they could see a list of scheduled emails. Everything you just saw went out 5 minutes ago. Local news. The State Engineering Board. The Attorney General's office. 3 labor safety groups. If I don't walk out of here, it still gets out. If you take my phone, it gets out. If you say I made it up, they already have the files. For the first time, Malcolm looked genuinely caught. Richard stared at the phone. His heartbeat was still too fast. He thought of headlines, investigations, depositions, stockholder calls, the new project dying before ground broke. He thought of his name above hospital wings and scholarship funds. He thought of 6 years of distance collapsing in a single morning. Then he thought of Grace Carter, not because he wanted to. Because Annie had placed that old money on his table, and now he could see a woman in a small house receiving it from one of Malcolm's people. He had not gone himself. At the time, he had called that professional. Clean, proper. He had signed off on the amount and moved to the next problem. Your mother signed the agreement, Richard said, but the words came out weaker than he expected. Annie's face changed then. and for the first time the room saw the child she had been. She signed it because she was alone, Annie said. Because her husband was dead, because your company had ruined his name, because the bills were on the kitchen table, because men in suits told her it was the best she would ever get. Don't mistake exhaustion for consent. Mrs. Caldwell lowered her eyes. Annie picked up one of the bills and held it between two fingers. She kept this money for 6 years. Do you know why? Because spending it felt like agreeing with you. Richard said nothing. She moved us out of Atlanta, because every grocery store, every church hallway, every school office had somebody who remembered the lie. She used to wake up at night saying my father's name like she was trying to pull him back from what you made of him. The boardroom had become smaller. The city outside no longer mattered. Nobody reached for coffee. Nobody checked a watch. Annie placed the bill back on the table. I came here today because my mother couldn't. My father can't. So I did. A knock sounded at the glass door. More security. Behind them, a woman from corporate communications stood pale, holding a tablet. Malcolm moved toward the door, but Harold Finch blocked him with one sentence. Nobody leaves with those files. Malcolm stared. You don't have authority to direct me. Harold looked at Richard. Maybe not, but by tonight, someone will. That was when Richard understood the first real truth of the morning. The danger was no longer Annie Carter. The danger was that others in the room were beginning to separate themselves from him. He turned back toward Annie, trying once more to become the man at the head of the table. You've made your point, he said. Now leave, before this becomes worse for you. Annie picked up the empty brown envelope and held it at her side. No, Mr. Whitmore, she said. For the first time, it's becoming worse for the right people. Samuel Carter's face stayed on the screen as the room filled with the sound of phones buzzing. One after another. Like alarms no one could silence. The first call came from the lobby. A receptionist on the ground floor told corporate communications that 2 reporters were asking whether Whitmore Development had a statement about a live video involving Samuel Carter. 30 seconds later, a producer from a local news station called the main office. Then came a message from the State Engineering Board, short and formal, requesting confirmation that the files circulating online were connected to the Whitmore Civic Tower investigation. By the time the 5th phone began vibrating on the conference table, nobody was pretending this could still be contained. Richard stood with one hand on the back of his chair, staring at the screen where Samuel Carter's photograph remained. He wanted someone to turn it off. He wanted Malcolm to take charge. He wanted the room to return to the clean order it had held before Annie opened the door. But every second that passed made him feel less like the owner of the building and more like a man trapped inside it. Malcolm finally reached for the media control panel. Turn that screen off. No, Mrs. Caldwell said. Malcolm turned slowly. This is not a vote. It is now, Harold Finch said. Richard looked at Harold. Don't start performing for the room. Harold's face flushed. But he did not back down. I'm not performing. I'm asking whether we all just watched evidence of a crime. Malcolm stepped toward him. Careful, that word is getting tired, Annie said. Malcolm looked at her as if he wanted to say something cruel, something final, but the phones kept buzzing. The sound was small, almost ridiculous, yet it carried the panic of the world outside pushing its way in. The communications director, Paula Grant, appeared at the glass door with 2 security officers behind her. She was usually composed, the kind of woman who could turn a lawsuit into 3 neutral sentences and a charitable donation. Now her tablet was clutched against her chest. Richard, she said, her voice thin. We need you in the crisis room. Richard seized the phrase like a rope. Crisis room. That sounded like structure. That sounded like professionals. Fine, Malcolm, with me. Annie moved before they could. She stepped between Richard and the door. Not close enough to touch him, but close enough to make him stop. You don't get to walk out first, she said. Richard stared at her. Move. No. Security shifted. Malcolm lifted a hand, stopping them before another bad image could be captured. He had finally learned to fear the phone in Annie's hand. Richard lowered his voice. You have no idea how much trouble you are in. Annie looked at the bills still lying across the table. You said that to my father too, didn't you? His face tightened. You thought fear would teach him where he belonged, she said. When it didn't, you built a lie big enough to bury him. Richard leaned closer. I did not kill your father. No, Annie said. You left that part to shame. The room went quiet enough for the words to settle. Paula swallowed and glanced at Malcolm. The video is already on 3 platforms. Channel 8 is running a clip. They're asking if the voice is yours, Richard. Malcolm said, no one confirms anything. Harold looked at Paula. Has the full file gone out? Paula hesitated. Answer him, Mrs. Caldwell said. Paula's eyes flicked toward Richard, then down to her tablet. It appears multiple files were sent to outside organizations, not just the video. Documents, too. Annie said nothing. She had already told them. Richard finally looked at her with something beyond anger. Who helped you do this? People who got tired of being afraid. Names. You don't get more names to ruin. Malcolm's tone sharpened. If you are referring to former employees, anyone who participated in theft of corporate material will be prosecuted. A voice came from the doorway. Then you'll have to prosecute me too. Everyone turned. An older woman stood behind Paula, one hand resting on a cane, the other gripping the strap of a worn leather purse. Her gray hair was pinned back, her coat damp from rain. She looked small beside the security men, but Annie's face changed when she saw her. Evelyn, Annie said softly. Evelyn Moore stepped into the room. Her eyes moved to Samuel's photograph on the screen, and for a moment the years seemed to press down on her. She had known that face, in paperwork first, then in guilt. Seeing it enlarged in the room where men had once decided his fate made her grip the cane harder. Malcolm went pale with recognition. You have no business being here. Evelyn gave a tired laugh. That's what I told myself 6 years ago. It didn't age well. Richard frowned. Who is this? Evelyn Moore, Annie said. She worked for Mr. Pierce when my father's file was changed. Malcolm snapped. She was a clerical employee with no authority and no full understanding of privileged legal matters. Evelyn looked at him. I understood enough to know when you told me to relabel Samuel Carter's safety report as informal correspondence. I understood enough when you asked me to remove the receipt log from the investigation packet. I understood enough when you said, no one will believe him over Richard. Malcolm's face went hard. You are lying. Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Her hand shook, but her voice did not. I wrote down what I was told the day I was told to do it. I kept copies because cowardice doesn't always kill your conscience. Sometimes it just makes it quiet for a while. She placed the paper on the table. No one touched it. Annie looked at Evelyn with a mixture of gratitude and old anger. You should have come sooner. I know, Evelyn said. Those 2 words held more weight than an apology. Annie accepted them only as truth, not as forgiveness. Richard stared between Evelyn and Malcolm. For the first time that morning, doubt turned inward, not toward the recording, toward the people who had kept him safe, or told him they had. Malcolm, he said slowly, what exactly did you do? Malcolm's eyes cut toward him. I protected the company. That wasn't my question. It's the only answer that matters. Mrs. Caldwell stood straighter. No, it isn't. The door opened again before Malcolm could respond. A younger assistant entered, breathless. Mr. Whitmore, there are reporters outside the building. More are on the way. The board office line is flooded. Someone from the governor's staff called. Richard closed his eyes for half a second. Annie watched him carefully. She had imagined this moment for years, but imagination had always made it cleaner. In her mind, Richard shouted, then confessed, then collapsed under the weight of what he had done. Real life was uglier. Men like him did not fall all at once. They reached for handles. They blamed advisors. They renamed choices. They survived by making guilt divisible. Richard opened his eyes and looked at her. You wanted a spectacle. You got one. No, Annie said. I wanted my father's name back. The spectacle is what happens when powerful men hide the truth too long. Paula's tablet chimed again. She read the message and went still. What? Richard demanded. She looked up. The families of 2 injured workers from the Civic Tower accident are speaking to reporters. One of them says Samuel Carter warned the crew before the collapse. Richard's throat moved. The room shifted around him. The story was no longer Annie's alone. Other voices were rising now. Voices he had never bothered to remember because the settlement checks had cleared and the legal record had closed. Evelyn looked at Annie. Your father wasn't alone, honey. They just made him look that way. Annie's eyes stung, but she would not cry in that room. Not yet. Malcolm grabbed his briefcase. This meeting is adjourned. Anything further will go through counsel. Harold stepped in front of him. You're not leaving with any device, file, or paper from this room. Malcolm smiled coldly. You're making a mistake. Harold looked at Samuel's face on the screen. I think I made it 6 years ago. Outside, through the glass walls, a news helicopter moved across the gray Atlanta sky, small at first, then closer. Richard heard it before he saw it, a low, circling sound. Annie heard it too. For 6 years, silence had belonged to Richard Whitmore. Now noise did. Phones, reporters, witnesses, old files, old guilt, all of it rising. She picked up the stack of scattered bills, gathered them into both hands, and placed them back in the center of the table. This stays here, she said, right where everyone can see what you thought my father was worth. Then she turned toward the door, not running, not hiding, not waiting for permission. Richard called after her, his voice rough. This won't bring him back. Annie stopped, but she did not turn around right away. When she did, her face was steady. I know, she said, but it might stop you from burying anyone else. Then she walked out, and this time, no guard tried to touch her. The hallway outside the conference room was no longer quiet. People who had spent years learning how not to stare were staring now. Assistants stood half out of office doors with phones in their hands. A junior analyst stepped back so quickly he nearly dropped his coffee. Somewhere down the corridor, a receptionist kept saying, "No comment at this time," in a voice that grew thinner each time she repeated it. Annie walked past all of them with Evelyn beside her. She still held the brown envelope under one arm, but the money remained on Richard Whitmore's table, where she had left it. Her hands felt strangely light without it. For 6 years, that stack of bills had sat in her mother's tin box like a stone in the house. Now it was back where it belonged, surrounded by the people who had once believed it could end a life and close a file. At the elevator, Evelyn touched Annie's sleeve. You all right? Annie looked at the glowing numbers above the doors. No. Evelyn nodded. That's an honest answer. The elevator opened. 2 men in suits were inside. They recognized Annie from the live stream, or maybe only from the look on every face in the hallway. Neither spoke. They stepped out and let her in. As the doors closed, Annie finally breathed. Her phone buzzed so many times it felt alive in her hand. Messages from numbers she did not know. Missed calls. A text from the reporter Evelyn had contacted. Another from a labor safety group. Then one from Mrs. Alvarez, the elderly woman who owned the diner back home. Baby girl, I saw you. Call your mama when you can. Annie stared at the message longer than the others. Grace. For a moment, the conference room vanished, and she saw the small house in rural Georgia, the porch with peeling white paint, the cracked bird bath, the kitchen where her mother kept medicine bottles in a plastic basket beside the toaster. Grace Carter had spent 6 years carrying Samuel's name like something fragile wrapped in cloth. Annie had promised herself she would call before the video went public. But the morning had moved too fast, and part of her had been afraid her mother would beg her to stop. The elevator reached the lobby. Noise hit them first. Reporters had gathered near the security barrier, held back by 2 guards and a woman from public relations who looked close to tears. Camera lights turned when Annie stepped out. Question came at once. Are you Annie Carter? Is the recording authentic? Did Richard Whitmore admit to falsifying safety documents? Was your father Samuel Carter? Evelyn leaned close. You don't have to talk right now. Annie knew that was true. She also knew silence had been the weapon used against her family. Still, she was not ready to hand her grief to strangers in the lobby of the building that had fed on it. She lifted one hand. The questions softened but did not stop. My father's name was Samuel Carter, she said. He was a good engineer. He warned them before the accident. The documents are already with the proper authorities. That's all I'm saying today. A reporter called. What do you want from Richard Whitmore? Annie paused. She thought of the money on the table, of Richard asking how much she wanted, of Malcolm speaking her mother's pain like it was leverage. I want the truth to stop being treated like a debt poor people can't afford to collect, she said. Then Evelyn guided her through the side exit. Outside, Atlanta was gray with rain. News vans idled at the curb. Office workers slowed on the sidewalk, pretending not to listen. Annie pulled her coat tighter and kept walking until they reached Evelyn's old sedan parked 2 blocks away in a paid lot. Only when the doors were closed did Annie call her mother. Grace answered on the 4th ring. Her voice was small. "Annie? Mama." There was silence, then a breath that trembled. "I saw it." Annie closed her eyes. "I'm sorry. I should have called first." "No," Grace said. "No, baby. Don't apologize for telling the truth." Annie pressed the phone harder to her ear. "Are you okay?" Grace gave a tired sound that was almost a laugh. "I haven't been okay in 6 years. But I heard your daddy's name on the news without them calling him careless. That's something." Annie bent forward, one hand over her mouth. Evelyn looked out the windshield and let her have the moment. "They played part of the recording?" Annie asked. "Just a piece. Enough." Grace's voice weakened, then steadied. "I heard Richard Whitmore's voice." Annie could hear the television in the background, low and urgent. "Mama." "I left the money there." Grace was quiet. "On his table," Annie said. "I couldn't carry it anymore." When Grace answered, her voice broke. "Good." That one word nearly undid Annie. Grace continued, softer now. "Your father used to say a man could lose a paycheck and still stand. But if they took his name, they took the ground under him. Today, you gave him some ground back." Annie wiped her cheek quickly, annoyed at the tear. "I don't know what happens next," she said. "Next, you eat something." Despite everything, Annie almost smiled. "Mama, I mean it. Truth doesn't run on an empty stomach. Your father learned that the hard way. He'd get so tied up in doing right. He'd forget lunch until I threatened to bring a plate to the job site and embarrass him in front of the whole crew." Annie pictured Samuel laughing in the kitchen, accepting a foil-wrapped biscuit from Grace as if it were a peace offering. The memory hurt, but not the way it usually did. "I'll eat," Annie said. "And Annie?" "Yes, ma'am. You don't let them turn you mean. Strong, yes. Clear, yes. But not mean. Your father wasn't mean, even when he had reason." Annie looked through the windshield at Whitmore Tower rising behind the rain. "I'm trying." "I know." After the call ended, Evelyn started the car but did not pull out. "She sounds like a good mother," Evelyn said. "She is. I should have gone to her years ago." Annie looked at her. The old anger was still there, but it had less room to move. "Yes, you should have." Evelyn nodded. "I know." They drove in silence for several blocks. The city looked different from the passenger seat now. Not kinder, not cleaner, but exposed. Annie saw construction cranes, bus stops, office towers, men in work vests eating from paper bags under awnings. She wondered how many names had been buried under schedules, how many families had been handed checks and told to disappear. At a red light, Evelyn's phone rang. She answered on speaker. A man's voice said, "Miss Moore, this is Daniel Price from Channel 8. We received the files. We also have a former Civic Tower worker willing to speak on record. He says Samuel Carter ordered men off the east scaffold the morning of the collapse." Annie sat up. Evelyn looked at her. "Is he sure?" "He says he's been sure for 6 years," the reporter replied. "He says he was too scared to say it then." Annie looked down at her hands. They were still shaking, but not from fear alone now. "Can I speak to him?" she asked. The reporter hesitated. "He asked the same thing about you." Evelyn took down the number. When the call ended, she parked beside a small diner near the interstate. The kind of place with a red sign, old booths, and coffee strong enough for truck drivers. "You need food," Evelyn said. "My mother tell you that?" "No, I'm old. We all end up giving the same advice." Inside, a waitress called them Han and brought coffee without asking too many questions. Annie ordered toast and eggs because it was all she could manage. The television above the counter was tuned to the local news. Her own face appeared on the screen for a second, then Samuel's photograph. The waitress stopped pouring coffee. "That your daddy?" she asked gently. Annie looked up. For years, that question had come with suspicion, pity, or gossip. This time it came with respect. "Yes," Annie said. "That's my father." The waitress nodded once. "Then I hope they say his name right." Annie looked at the screen. where the caption now read, "New evidence raises questions in Civic Tower case." She picked up her fork, but her throat tightened before she could eat. Evelyn pushed the plate a little closer. One bite. Annie obeyed. Outside, rain slid down the window. Inside, Samuel Carter's name moved across the bottom of the television screen, no longer buried in an old report, no longer trapped in a tin box with dirty money. For the first time since she was a child, Annie heard the world begin to say her father's name differently. The man who had been too scared to speak for 6 years was named Calvin Brooks. He called Annie that afternoon while she and Evelyn were still sitting in the diner, the remains of eggs cooling on Annie's plate, and Samuel Carter's photograph still showing every few minutes on the television above the counter. Annie almost did not answer. The number was unfamiliar, and after that morning, every unknown call felt like another door opening to a room she was not ready to enter. Evelyn saw her hesitation and gave a small nod. Annie picked up. "This is Annie." For a moment, there was only breathing on the other end. "My name is Calvin Brooks," the man said. His voice was rough, older than Annie expected. "I worked the east scaffold at Civic Tower." Annie sat straighter. Calvin continued before she could ask anything. "Your father told us not to go up that morning." He stood there with his hands out, blocking the access stairs, saying the section hadn't been cleared. "I remember because some of us laughed. Not at him. Just, nervous. Men laugh when they don't want to admit they're scared." Annie closed her eyes and listened. "He told Brett Harlan the supports were wrong. Brett told him the order came from above. Your father said, then above can come down here and put their own sons on that scaffold." Evelyn looked at Annie across the table. Neither of them spoke. Calvin's breath shook. "I should have said that years ago." "Why didn't you?" Annie asked. She tried to keep her voice even, but it came out sharper than she meant. "I had 2 kids, a mortgage, a wife with diabetes. Whitmore paid our medical bills after the fall, then made it clear there'd be nothing else if we caused trouble. A lawyer came to my hospital room before I could even walk right. He said Mr. Carter had missed the inspection. Said the company was prepared to help families who cooperated." Calvin paused. "I cooperated." Annie stared at the fork beside her plate. "I hated myself for it," he said. "That didn't help my father." "No, ma'am, it didn't." The way he said ma'am nearly broke something in her. He was a grown man, old enough to be her uncle, maybe older, and he was giving her the respect her father had been denied. Calvin cleared his throat. "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm calling because Channel 8 asked if I'd go on camera. I said yes, but I wanted to tell you first." Annie looked up at the television. A reporter was standing outside Whitmore Tower now, rain on her coat, speaking into a microphone. "Tell the truth," Annie said. "That's all. I can do that." "No," Annie said softly. "You could always do that. Today you're choosing to." The line went quiet. When Calvin answered, his voice was lower. "You sound like him." Annie ended the call before she cried. Evelyn did not reach for her hand. She had learned Annie did not need every emotion touched. She only said, "That matters." Annie nodded. "It matters late. Most justice does." Annie looked at her then. Evelyn stirred her coffee, though there was nothing left to mix. "Justice is not always fair, Annie. Sometimes it only arrives after everything it should have saved is already gone." The words stayed with Annie as they drove back toward Evelyn's house. The rain had thinned to a mist, leaving the streets slick and gray. Atlanta moved around them like nothing had happened. Buses hissed at corners. Construction workers walked in small groups under plastic ponchos. A man sold umbrellas outside a train station. Life did not stop when a truth came out. That was one of the cruel things about truth. It could shake a family to its bones while the rest of the city still needed lunch. At Evelyn's house, Annie finally saw the scale of what had begun. Evelyn's dining table had been turned into a command center. Copies of files were stacked beside a laptop. A legal pad listed names: Calvin Brooks, Renee Talbot, State Engineering Board, Channel 8, Attorney General, Labor Safety Coalition. Evelyn had written them in block letters, the way older women wrote grocery lists and church volunteer schedules, practical and serious. Annie called her mother again. Grace sounded tired but clearer than she had in weeks. "Calvin Brooks called me. Annie said. The welder? You remember him? Your father did. He came home from the hospital the day after the accident and kept saying Calvin had a little boy. He was worried Calvin wouldn't be able to pick him up for a while. Grace's voice softened. That was your daddy. His own world was falling apart, and he was thinking about another man's child. Annie pressed her fingers against her eyes. He's going on camera. Good. You're not scared? I'm terrified, Grace said. But scared and silent are not the same thing. Annie looked out Evelyn's front window. Across the street, an older man in a baseball cap was bringing in his trash cans. He moved slowly, favoring one knee. His wife opened the door and said something Annie could not hear. He waved her off, smiling, then carried both cans anyway. Ordinary tenderness, ordinary stubbornness. The kind of life Samuel should have been allowed to grow old into. Mama, Annie said, people are going to talk about him again. Grace was quiet. They might say ugly things before they say the truth. I know. I don't want it to hurt you more. Grace took a slow breath. Baby, hurt that stays hidden doesn't get smaller. It just learns where to sit. Annie did not answer. Listen to me, Grace said. When they lied about your father, I thought leaving Atlanta would save us. I thought if I took you somewhere quiet, the lie would stay behind. But it came with us. It sat at our table. It followed you to school. It got into my sleep. Maybe today is the first day it has to sit in somebody else's house. After they hung up, Annie walked into Evelyn's small guest room and closed the door. On the dresser sat the framed photograph she had brought from home. Samuel in his work vest. Grace beside him, younger and smiling. Annie as a child between them, missing one front tooth. She picked it up and sat on the bed. For years, she had imagined revenge as a door slamming shut. Richard exposed. Malcolm ruined. Her father's name cleared. But now that the first door had opened, she saw more doors behind it. Reporters would call. Lawyers would threaten. Strangers would debate her father's life on television. Some would believe. Some would not. Some would ask why it had taken 6 years, as if grief came with a deadline and power ever surrendered evidence politely. A knock came softly. It's me, Evelyn said. Annie wiped her face. Come in. Evelyn opened the door but stayed near the frame. Channel 8 is airing Calvin's interview at 6. Annie nodded. There's more, Evelyn said. I received an email from a woman named Renee Talbot. She was a nurse at the hospital after the collapse. She says a Whitmore attorney visited injured workers before investigators did. She kept notes. Annie looked up. Evelyn's expression was tired but firm. Your father's report was the beginning, not the end. Annie set the photograph back on the dresser. How many people knew? I don't know. How many people stayed quiet? Evelyn did not defend anyone this time. Too many. Annie stood. The exhaustion in her body was real, but beneath it, something steadier had formed. Not hope exactly. Hope felt too soft for what this was. It was more like direction. Then we keep going, she said. At 6 o'clock, they sat in Evelyn's living room and watched Calvin Brooks appear on television. He wore a clean button-down shirt and sat beside a woman Annie guessed was his wife. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap. The reporter asked, Did Samuel Carter ignore safety concerns? Calvin shook his head. No. He raised them, loud and clear. That morning, he tried to keep us off that scaffold. I didn't say it then because I was scared. I'm saying it now because his daughter shouldn't have to carry the truth alone. Annie did not move. On the screen, Calvin looked into the camera. Samuel Carter did his job. We didn't do ours when we let them blame him. Grace called before the segment ended. Annie answered and heard her mother crying, but this time the sound was different. He said Samuel did his job, Grace whispered. Yes, ma'am. He said it out loud. Annie looked at her father's photograph across the room. Yes, she said. He did. Outside, the rain stopped. The evening light came through Evelyn's curtains in a thin gold line. For the first time, Annie understood that clearing her father's name would not be one moment in a boardroom. It would be many voices, one after another, deciding they were done being afraid. And somewhere across the city, Richard Whitmore was beginning to understand the same thing. Richard Whitmore did not watch Calvin Brooks on the evening news from his office. He watched from a smaller room 3 floors below the board suite. a room Whitmore Development called the crisis room, because men in expensive suits preferred that phrase to panic. The walls were covered with screens. One showed Channel 8. Another showed social media feeds moving too fast to read. A third showed Whitmore Development stock price after hours, though the market was closed and nothing official had happened yet. Paula Grant sat with two communications staffers, writing and deleting statements. Malcolm Pierce stood near the end of the table, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a low voice that meant he was either threatening someone or trying not to sound threatened himself. Richard sat apart from them, his jacket off, tie loosened, one hand around a glass of water he had not touched. On the screen, Calvin Brooks said, "Samuel Carter did his job. We didn't do ours when we let them blame him." Paula closed her eyes. Malcolm ended his call. "We need to discredit Brooks before this grows." Richard looked at him slowly. "He was injured in the collapse. That doesn't make him credible. He was there. So were a lot of people. Memory changes. Fear changes. Lawyers change things back." Richard stared at Malcolm. He had heard that tone for years and had once admired it. Malcolm could take any human thing and turn it into a manageable category. Exposure, liability, claimant, witness, settlement. It had made him useful. Tonight it made him sound obscene. Paula looked up from her laptop. "The public won't respond well if we attack an injured worker." "I didn't say attack," Malcolm said. "I said discredit." "That's the same sentence with a better haircut," she replied. Richard almost looked at her. In another moment, he might have smiled at the line. "Not now." Malcolm ignored her. "We release a statement tonight. We express sympathy for the Carter family, state that the company relied on the official findings at the time, and announce an independent review conducted by a firm we choose. We do not admit wrongdoing. We do not authenticate the recording. We do not mention Annie Carter by name." Richard rubbed his eyes. "And the video? We say it appears edited." "Is it?" Malcolm's silence lasted half a second too long. Richard lowered his hand. "I asked you a question." Malcolm walked closer. "Richard, this is not the moment to get sentimental. You built this company by understanding one thing better than everyone else. The first version of a story wins only if the second version is weak. We make their version look emotional, incomplete, and politically motivated. Their version has my voice on it. Voices can be challenged. And Evelyn Moore, a former clerical employee with a grievance and no authority. Calvin Brooks, a frightened man who wants attention." Richard looked at the screen where Calvin's interview was replaying. The man's hands were clasped so tightly his knuckles looked pale. He did not look like a man seeking attention. He looked like a man trying to stand up under weight he had carried too long. Paula's phone buzzed. She read the message and went still. "What now?" Richard asked. "The Atlanta Journal-Constitution is preparing a timeline piece for tomorrow morning. They have the original safety report, the altered report, and the receipt log." Malcolm turned on her. "Who confirmed that?" "They asked us for comment. That's confirmation enough." Another staffer said, "The governor's office wants distance. They're canceling tomorrow's photo op." Richard let out a short breath. The new project, the one that had been on the screen when Annie walked in, was already becoming contaminated. He could feel people stepping away from him without leaving the room. "Get me Mrs. Caldwell," he said. Paula hesitated. She left the building. "Then call her. She's not taking calls from us." "From us, not from me." Richard heard the difference. Malcolm placed both hands on the table. "We do not chase board members tonight. We contain the legal perimeter." Richard looked up. "You keep saying we, because we are in this together." "No," Richard said. "That's what I'm trying to understand." The room quieted. Malcolm's face changed by a fraction. "Be careful." Richard laughed once without humor. "There's that word again." Paula's younger assistant, a woman named Dana, spoke from the far side of the table. "Sir, there's something else. Annie Carter's live stream has been clipped and shared by several labor unions. The phrase dirty money is trending locally." Malcolm muttered. "Of course it is." Dana continued. "People are posting photos of settlement checks from old job site accidents. Not just ours. It's becoming bigger." Richard looked at the screens. Annie's face appeared in one clip, steady and unforgiving. Then Samuel's photograph. Then the bills on the table. The money bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Not the amount. The image. Cash scattered across the boardroom like evidence of a crime too simple for lawyers to complicate. His private phone rang. He looked at the screen and almost ignored it. Then he saw the name. Claire. His ex-wife rarely called. She preferred texts about their son, holiday schedules, charity obligations. He stepped into the narrow hallway outside the crisis room and answered. Claire. I saw it, she said. He leaned against the wall. Everyone saw it. Is it true? He closed his eyes. It's complicated. No, Richard. Complicated is when people disagree over dinner plans. Is it true? He said nothing. Claire's voice softened, which somehow made it worse. I remember that year. You came home every night angry. You kept saying one man was holding up the tower. Richard opened his eyes. You said he didn't understand scale, she continued. You said he was making a career out of being difficult. I was under pressure. You were always under pressure. That was your favorite excuse. He looked through the glass wall into the crisis room. Malcolm was speaking again. Paula was typing. People were building a defense around him in real time, the way they had always done. Claire said, Our son just texted me from college. He asked if his father ruined a man's life. Richard felt the words land in his chest. What did you tell him? He asked. I told him to ask you. The call ended. Richard stood in the hallway for a long moment. On the wall across from him hung a framed photograph from the Civic Tower groundbreaking. He was in the center, smiling with a gold shovel. The mayor stood to his left. Behind them were workers in hard hats. Samuel Carter was not in the photo. Richard did not know if that was chance or design. Tonight, everything felt like design. When he returned to the room, Malcolm was dictating a statement. Whitmore Development categorically denies any intentional falsification of records. Stop, Richard said. Malcolm lowered the phone. Excuse me? Don't release that. Paula froze over her keyboard. Malcolm stared at him. If we don't respond, they own the night. Richard looked at the screens again. They already do. That is fear talking. No, Richard said. That might be the first accurate thing I've said today. Malcolm stepped close enough that the others could pretend not to listen. Richard, if you admit anything, you are finished. Personally, professionally, civil exposure, criminal exposure, shareholder suits, state investigations. You think Annie Carter wants truth? She wants blood. Richard thought of Annie standing across from him, pointing at the money. He thought of her saying her mother kept it in a tin box because spending it felt like agreeing with him. No, he said quietly. She wanted me to remember her father. Malcolm's expression hardened. Then remember him in private. Publicly, we fight. Before Richard could answer, Dana spoke again, her voice small. Channel 8 just announced a special segment tomorrow. They found a nurse from the hospital after the collapse. Renee Talbot. She says a Whitmore attorney visited injured workers before investigators took full statements. Malcolm turned sharply. That woman signed a confidentiality agreement. Paula looked at him. You know her? The room went silent. Malcolm realized his mistake at the same moment Richard did. Richard's voice dropped. Why would a hospital nurse sign a confidentiality agreement with us? Malcolm did not answer. Richard stepped toward him. What did you do after the collapse? I protected the company, Malcolm said again. No, I want details. You don't want details. The sentence stripped the room of its last illusion. Richard looked at Paula. No statement tonight. Malcolm snapped. Richard, no statement. Preserve all files. No deletions. No calls to witnesses. No contact with Annie Carter, her mother, Evelyn Moore, Calvin Brooks, or this nurse. You're giving orders that will damage us. Richard looked at him. For 6 years I gave orders that protected me. Maybe damage is overdue. Malcolm picked up his briefcase. Then I need my own counsel. Richard almost asked why. He did not have to. Malcolm left the room without another word. No one stopped him. That too said something. Paula closed her laptop halfway. What do you want me to tell the press? Richard looked at the Civic Tower photograph on the screen. Then at Samuel Carter's face in another window beside it. Tell them, he said slowly, that Whitmore Development will not dispute the existence of the original safety report tonight. Paula's eyes widened. That's close to an admission. Richard nodded. His voice sounded strange to him, older. I know. Across town, Annie Carter was sitting in Evelyn Moore's living room, unaware that the first wall inside Whitmore had cracked. But cracks, once opened, do not ask permission to spread. Annie did not sleep that night. Evelyn gave her the guest room, a clean towel, and a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender detergent, but the bed felt too soft and the house too quiet. Every time Annie closed her eyes, she heard Richard's voice from the recording. Make it look like his failure, not mine. Then she heard Calvin Brooks on the news. Samuel Carter did his job. Then her mother, tired but steady, scared and silent, are not the same thing. At 2:13 inches the morning, Annie sat up and checked her phone again. There were hundreds of messages now. Some were kind, some were ugly. Strangers called her brave. Other strangers called her a liar, a thief, a girl looking for money. A few used words she had heard whispered in school hallways after her father died, words meant to remind her that some people did not need facts before deciding who deserved blame. She set the phone face down. From the hallway came the slow sound of Evelyn moving through the house. A cabinet opened. A spoon touched ceramic. Annie stepped out and found her in the kitchen making tea under the small yellow light above the stove. You too? Evelyn asked. Annie leaned against the counter. I don't think my body knows how to stop. That happens after you spend years holding your breath. Evelyn poured hot water into 2 mugs. The kitchen was old, with flowered curtains and a clock shaped like a rooster. It reminded Annie of homes she had known growing up. Homes where older women kept butter dishes on the counter, church bulletins on the fridge, and emergency cash folded into coffee tins. Evelyn set a mug in front of her. Honey? No, Evelyn almost smiled. Your mother raised you Southern. My mother raised me tired. Southern came with it. They sat at the small table. For a while, neither spoke. Outside, the rain had started again, softer than before. Finally, Evelyn slid a folded newspaper clipping across the table. It was old, yellowed at the edges. The headline read, Civic Tower Safety Supervisor, under review after scaffold collapse. Annie did not touch it. Why do you have that? I kept everything I was ashamed of. That doesn't make sense. It does when you get old, Evelyn said. At first you keep proof in case somebody comes asking. Later, you keep it because forgetting would feel like another crime. Annie read the article. Samuel's name appeared in the second paragraph, attached to phrases like missed inspection and procedural failure. No mention of his warning. No mention of altered bracing. No mention of Richard. My mother cut this one out, Annie said. She folded it and put it in a Bible. I found it when I was 14. Evelyn looked pained. Why would she keep it? To remind herself what they said. She was afraid if she forgot the lie, she'd forget what she was fighting in her own head. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her mug. Grace is stronger than I was. Annie did not argue. Just after 6, Evelyn's phone rang. She answered, listened, then reached for a pen. Yes, she said. No, don't send it through your work email. Use the address I gave you, and keep the original notes somewhere safe, not in your car. Annie watched her write a name. Renee Talbot. When Evelyn hung up, she looked across the table. The nurse is willing to meet. Today? In 2 hours. A church basement in Decatur. She doesn't trust offices. Annie stood. Let's go. Eat first. I'm not hungry. You don't have to be hungry to need food. That sounded so much like Grace that Annie sat back down. Evelyn made toast and scrambled eggs. Annie ate because old women had a way of turning concern into instruction, and because her mother had already ordered the same thing over the phone. By 8, they were driving through wet streets toward Decatur, past school buses, gas stations, and strip malls just opening for the day. Atlanta looked ordinary again, but Annie knew somewhere behind glass walls, men were reading her father's name with legal pads in front of them. The church sat on a quiet corner, red brick, modest steeple, a sign out front advertising Sunday service and a food pantry. In the basement, folding chairs were stacked along one wall. The air smelled of coffee, old hymnals, and floor cleaner. Renee Talbot was waiting at a plastic table with a paper cup between her hands. She was in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, black, with short gray hair and nurse's shoes that had seen years of hospital floors. She stood when Annie entered, then seemed unsure whether to offer a handshake or an apology. Annie saved her from choosing. "Miss Talbot?" "Yes." Renee's eyes moved over Annie's face. "Lord, you look like him. I've heard that a lot lately. I'm sorry. People say that like it's easy to carry." Annie sat across from her. Evelyn sat beside Annie, opened a notebook, and said nothing. Renee took a breath. "I was charge nurse on the orthopedic floor the week after the Civic Tower collapse. 2 of the injured men were under my care. Calvin Brooks was one. The other was Michael Reyes. Broken pelvis, cracked ribs, concussion. They were scared, in pain, medicated, and before the state investigator came, a Whitmore attorney showed up." "Malcolm?" Evelyn asked. "Not him. Younger man. But he said he worked under Pierce." Annie leaned in. "What did he want?" "Statements. He said the company needed to process support payments." That was the phrase. Support payments. He asked those men if Samuel Carter had personally cleared the scaffold. Asked it over and over in different ways. When Michael said Mr., Carter told them not to go up. The attorney said Michael was confused because of the concussion. Annie's fingers curled under the table. Renee reached into her purse and pulled out a small spiral notebook, the kind nurses use to jot times and medication reminders. "I wrote it down. Not officially. Just for myself. I knew it was wrong." "Why didn't you report it?" Annie asked. Renee met the question without flinching. "Because my daughter was in college, and my husband had just been laid off. Because hospitals don't protect nurses who bring trouble into expensive rooms. Because I told myself somebody with more authority would say something. Everybody thought somebody else would," Annie said. "Yes." Renee pushed the notebook toward her. "I am sorry." Annie looked at it but did not pick it up right away. "Sorry doesn't give him 6 years back." "No," Renee said. "It doesn't." That honest answer mattered more than any excuse. Evelyn asked, "Will you go on record?" Renee nodded. "I already spoke to Channel 8. But I'll also give a sworn statement. I'm retired now. They can threaten my pension if they want. I'm old enough to be tired of being useful to cowards." Annie picked up the notebook. The pages were filled with tight handwriting. Dates, times, room numbers, names. One line stopped her. Patient states S. Carter warned crew not to enter East Scaffold. Attorney advised patient not to speculate. Annie read it twice. Her father had not been alone. He had been surrounded by people who knew pieces of the truth. But each piece had been hidden in someone's fear. Renee said quietly, "Your father came to the hospital the first day." Annie looked up. "He wasn't allowed onto the floor at first. Company people were everywhere. But later I saw him near the elevators. He asked about every injured worker by name. Not about himself, not about the investigation. Them. He wanted to know if Calvin's leg would heal right, if Michael could breathe without pain, if Jesse's wife had been called." Annie's throat tightened. Renee continued, "A careless man doesn't remember names like that." For the first time that morning, Annie let herself close her eyes. Evelyn touched the notebook lightly. "This helps." "It should have helped then," Renee said. "Yes," Evelyn answered. "It should have." When they left the church basement, the rain had stopped. Annie stood on the steps with the notebook against her chest. Across the street, a school crossing guard in a yellow vest helped 2 children over the road, one hand raised to stop traffic. Annie watched until the children reached the other side. "My father used to say safety was love with a checklist," she said. Evelyn smiled sadly. "Sounds like him." Annie looked at the notebook. They made him look careless because careful men are dangerous when they refuse to lie. Her phone buzzed. A message from Grace. "I saw the nurse. Your daddy would have thanked her and fed her." Annie laughed once, small and painful. Evelyn's phone rang before they reached the car. She answered, listened, and her face changed. "What is it?" Annie asked. Evelyn lowered the phone slowly. "Whitmore Development just released a statement. They're not disputing the existence of your father's original report." Annie stood still. For 6 years, the world had said the report did not exist. Now the company that buried it had been forced to admit there was something to bury. Annie looked up at the gray sky over Decatur and breathed like a person testing air after a long time underground. "Good," she said. "Now we make them say why they hid it." By noon, Whitmore Development's statement was on every local news site in Atlanta. The company did not apologize. It did not say Samuel Carter had been right. It used careful words arranged by careful people. Newly surfaced materials. Pending review. Original documentation. No final conclusions at this time. But one sentence mattered more than all the others. Whitmore Development does not dispute that a safety report authored by Samuel Carter existed prior to the Civic Tower incident. Annie read it on Evelyn's phone in the church parking lot, then read it again in the passenger seat as they drove back through Decatur. The sentence was stiff and bloodless, but to her it sounded like a door unlocking. For 6 years, the official story had been that her father's warning had never existed. Now the people who buried it had been forced to admit there had been a body in the ground. Evelyn kept both hands on the wheel. They're trying to give up an inch before they're forced to give up a mile. "Let them," Annie said. "We'll take the inch and keep walking." Evelyn glanced at her. "You sound like your mother. My mother would tell me to eat before saying something like that." "She's right." Annie's phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she did not recognize. She almost ignored it. But something made her answer. "Annie Carter?" "Yes. My name is Thomas Bell. I was a junior inspector on Civic Tower." Evelyn's eyes shifted toward her. Annie sat straighter. "What do you want, Mr. Bell?" "To say I'm sorry first, then to tell you I have something." Annie looked at the traffic ahead, where brake lights glowed red in the damp afternoon. "What kind of something?" "A copy of the inspection timeline they changed." Her grip tightened around the phone. Thomas spoke quickly, as if afraid courage had an expiration date. "I was 24 then. First big job. I thought Whitmore was the kind of place that made careers. Samuel Carter scared people because he checked everything. Not in a bad way. He just didn't let sloppy work pass because a supervisor was tired or a deadline was close. Some guys complained, but the older workers trusted him. Did you know they blamed him?" "I knew after. I didn't know before. Not all of it." He swallowed audibly. The week after the collapse, Malcolm Pierce's office asked for all field logs. When the final version came back, the timestamps had changed. It made it look like Carter cleared the east scaffold before the second shift went up. "Did you keep proof?" "I kept the draft I sent in. I shouldn't have. I was told to delete everything. But my father was a union man. He used to say, if a boss asks you to destroy paper, that paper might be the only honest man in the room." Annie closed her eyes for a second. "Can you send it?" "I already sent it to the email Miss Moore gave the nurse. Renee Talbot passed it to me. I didn't know if I should call." "You should have called 6 years ago." "I know," Thomas said. "No defense. No excuse. I was scared." Annie let the silence sit between them. She was beginning to understand that fear had been the second building Richard built, and too many people had lived inside it. "Will you go on record?" she asked. "I need to talk to my wife." "That's fair. She told me to call you." Despite herself, Annie smiled faintly. "Then listen to your wife." Thomas gave a strained laugh. "That's what my father would have said too." When the call ended, Evelyn pulled into the parking lot of a small copy shop and parked. "We need printed sets," she said. "Digital is good. Paper still makes older men nervous." Inside the shop, a young clerk with earbuds helped them print 3 full packets. Samuel's original report, the altered report, Renee's notes, Calvin's statement, the receipt log, and now Thomas Bell's inspection timeline. Annie watched page after page slide from the printer. She had spent years with scraps, one old article, one damaged USB, one name written on paper. Now the truth had weight. It could be stacked. It could be handed across a table. It could make a man sweat. The clerk glanced at the top page and then at Annie. Recognition crossed his face. "You're the girl from the Whitmore video." Annie tensed. He lowered his voice. "My uncle worked construction all his life. Fell off a job in Savannah. Company says Stransley unclipped his own harness. My aunt never believed it." He tapped the stack gently. "Hope you get them." Annie did not know what to say. Evelyn did. "Thank you, son." Outside, Annie carried one packet against her chest. "It's not just my father anymore. No, Evelyn said. It probably never was. They returned to Evelyn's house to find two news vans parked across the street. Evelyn drove past without slowing, turned the corner, and pulled into the garage from the alley. Back door, she said. We're not feeding them your face every hour. Inside, the answering machine blinked with messages. Evelyn ignored it. Annie called Grace, but there was no answer. She called again. Nothing. Her stomach dropped. Mama always answers, she said. Evelyn took her keys back off the hook. Hospital? Annie nodded, already moving. The drive felt longer than it was. Annie called the nurse's desk at the rural clinic near their town and finally got a receptionist who knew Grace. She's all right, the woman said. She had a panic spell after some reporters came by the house. Annie's voice sharpened. Reporters went to our house? I think one reporter and a cameraman. Mrs. Carter wouldn't open the door. A neighbor brought her in. Annie thanked her and hung up, anger rising so fast it made her hands cold. They went to my mother's house. Evelyn's mouth tightened. Then we set a boundary today, Grace answered on the next call from the clinic. Her voice sounded embarrassed, which made Annie angrier than fear would have. I'm fine, Grace said before Annie could speak. You're at the clinic, because Mrs. Alvarez overreacts. Mama, Grace sighed. A man knocked on the door, said he only wanted a few words. Then the camera light came on through the window. I couldn't breathe for a minute. That's all. That's not all. No, Grace admitted. It felt like the old days, people wanting me to explain your father like he was a mistake I made. Annie turned her face toward the car window. Grace continued, but Mrs. Alvarez came over with her housecoat on and told them if they didn't leave, she'd introduce their camera to her cast iron skillet. So that part was nice. Annie laughed once, unwillingly. You're sure you're okay? I'm tired, not broken. Grace paused. Don't come running back here unless you need to. Finish what you started. Annie closed her eyes. I hate that this is touching you again. It never stopped touching me, baby. The words stayed with Annie after the call ended. By late afternoon, Evelyn arranged a short statement outside her house. Not a press conference, just enough to push reporters away from Grace. Annie stood on the porch with Evelyn beside her and spoke into 3 microphones. My mother is not part of your story to chase down, Annie said. She is a widow who carried a lie for 6 years. If you have questions, ask Whitmore Development why Samuel Carter's report disappeared. Ask Malcolm Pierce why injured workers were approached before investigators. Ask Richard Whitmore why my father's warning was hidden. Do not stand on my mother's porch asking her to bleed for your camera. A reporter asked, Are you accusing Whitmore of witness intimidation? Annie answered, I'm saying people were scared into silence. You can choose the legal word. Evelyn almost smiled. That evening, Channel 8 aired Renee Talbot's interview. Renee sat upright, nurse's hands folded, and told the city that Whitmore attorneys had shaped statements while injured men were still medicated. Then they aired Calvin again. Then they showed Thomas Bell's altered timeline. By 9, the state attorney general announced a preliminary inquiry. Annie watched the announcement from Evelyn's living room with a blanket around her shoulders and a plate of untouched soup on her lap. The words preliminary inquiry sounded small, but Evelyn reached over and squeezed her wrist. That means they can subpoena, Evelyn said. People lie less comfortably under subpoena. Annie looked at the television. Richard's picture appeared beside the Civic Tower frame, then Samuel's. What happens to him now? She asked. Richard? Annie nodded. Evelyn leaned back, tired. Men like him don't fall because one stone hits them. They fall when everyone sees the wall was already cracked. Annie thought of the conference room, the money on the table, the way Richard's face had shifted when his own voice filled the room. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. This is Claire Whitmore, Richard's former wife. I believe we need to talk. Annie read it twice. Evelyn saw her expression. What is it? Annie handed her the phone. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion alone but calculation. That could matter. Annie looked back at the screen, where a reporter stood outside Whitmore Tower under bright lights. Or it could be another door they want me to walk through alone. Then you don't walk alone. Annie held the phone in both hands. She had learned that day that truth did not come from one place. It came from nurses, workers, old secretaries, Draft logs, widows, daughters, even people who had waited too long. Maybe now it would come from inside Richard Whitmore's own house. She typed one sentence. Tomorrow, public place. Evelyn Moore comes with me. The reply came less than a minute later. Yes. Annie set the phone down. Outside, cameras still waited under the streetlights. But inside Evelyn's house, for the first time all day, nobody spoke. They simply listened to the low sound of the news and the rain starting again, while the circle around Richard Whitmore grew smaller. Claire Whitmore chose a coffee shop near Piedmont Park, not one of the places where her name would mean anything. It was small, busy enough to make a scene difficult and quiet enough for a conversation if people kept their voices low. Older men read newspapers near the window. A mother cut a muffin in half for a child in a stroller. 2 nurses in scrubs stood in line, talking about overtime. Annie noticed all of it before she noticed Claire. Because she had learned to read rooms before trusting them, Claire sat in a corner booth with both hands around a paper cup. She was in her late 40s, maybe, with careful hair, no jewelry except a wedding band she no longer had a reason to wear, and a face that looked like it had not slept. When Annie and Evelyn approached, Claire stood. Annie, she said, thank you for coming. Annie did not take the offered hand. You said we needed to talk. Claire lowered her hand without offense. We do. Evelyn slid into the booth beside Annie. This conversation is not off the record, unless Annie decides it is. Claire nodded. I understand. That's a good start, Annie said. Now tell me why Richard Whitmore's ex-wife is texting me. Claire looked down at her coffee. Because last night my son asked me if his father ruined a man's life. I didn't know how to answer him without lying. Annie said nothing. Claire continued. I was married to Richard when Civic Tower was being built. I didn't work for the company. I didn't see legal files. But I heard things. At home. At dinners. In phone calls he thought I wasn't listening to. Evelyn opened her notebook. What kind of things? Claire glanced toward the front counter, then back. He talked about Samuel Carter. Not often by name at first. He called him the engineer. Then the obstructionist. Then, Carter. He said one man was threatening hundreds of jobs because he wanted to be right. Annie's jaw tightened. My father wanted people safe. I know that now. You could have known then. Claire accepted it with a small nod. Yes. That answer unsettled Annie more than denial would have. People kept coming to her with late honesty, and she did not know where to put all of it. Claire reached into her purse and removed a sealed envelope. She placed it on the table but did not push it forward yet. I kept a journal during that time, she said. Not every day. Just when things at home got bad. Richard was under pressure. Angry. Drinking more than usual. I wrote some of what he said, because I was trying to understand the man I had married. Evelyn's pen paused. You have entries about Samuel? Yes. Annie looked at the envelope. Why keep them? Claire gave a tired smile. At first because I thought I might need them in the divorce. Later because I didn't know what else to do with the truth. That's becoming a popular excuse, Annie said. Claire's eyes lifted. I'm not asking you to make me comfortable. Good. Claire pushed the envelope forward. Annie did not touch it. Evelyn did, opening it carefully. Inside were photocopied journal pages and a small flash drive. Claire explained. The drive has 2 voicemails Richard left me the week after the collapse. He was angry because I had asked whether the man being blamed had children. In one message, he said, Carter made his choice when he chose to fight the schedule. In another, he said, Grace Carter should take the money and be grateful I'm not letting legal bury them completely. Annie went still. The coffee shop noise continued around them. Cups, chairs, milk steaming, ordinary life pressing against a sentence that had just cut into her. He said my mother should be grateful. Claire's eyes filled, but she did not let herself cry. Yes. Annie looked away. Through the window, an older couple walked slowly along the sidewalk under one umbrella. The woman held the man's arm as if she had been doing it for 40 years. Annie thought of Grace sitting alone at their kitchen table with the tin box in front of her. Evelyn read one of the copied pages. Her mouth tightened. This entry says Richard told you there was no court in Georgia that would take Carter's word over the company's documentation. Claire nodded. That was the night after the accident. Annie turned back. Why now? My son, Claire said, "and because I saw your mother's name in the news. I remember Richard sending that settlement. I remember asking if he was going himself. He said widows cry less when the check comes from council." Annie stood so fast the booth shook. Evelyn touched her wrist. "Annie." "No," Annie said. Her voice was low, but people at the next table glanced over. Everybody remembers something now. Everybody kept something. Everybody felt bad. My father died with the world calling him careless. My mother broke piece by piece, and all of you were sitting in houses with journals and notes and copies. Claire did not defend herself. Annie leaned over the table. "Do you know what I had? I had a tin box of money that made my mother sick to look at. I had kids at school asking if my father killed people. I had newspaper clippings with his name dragged through mud. That's what I had." "I know," Claire whispered. "No, you don't. You know now because it reached your son." Claire flinched because the words were true. Evelyn said softly, "Annie, breathe." Annie turned toward the window. She did not want to give Claire Whitmore her tears. She did not want to become the angry girl Malcolm had tried to sell to the room upstairs. But anger had its own dignity when it was telling the truth. After a moment, she sat back down. Claire pushed the drive closer. "I can give a sworn statement. I will not hide behind divorce, privilege, or memory. I should have come forward when Grace Carter was still young enough to hear it, without all this pain." Annie looked at her. "My mother is not old." "No, but grief aged her. Richard helped do that. I did nothing to stop it." That was the first sentence Claire said that Annie believed without resistance. Evelyn closed the envelope. "We'll make copies. You should retain your own counsel before giving a sworn statement." "I have," Claire said. "Not Richard's people." Annie almost smiled at that. Almost. Claire took a folded photograph from her purse and placed it beside the envelope. It showed a company dinner years earlier. Richard stood near a fireplace, glass in hand. Malcolm was beside him. In the background, slightly blurred, Samuel Carter stood near the edge of the room, wearing a dark suit that did not quite fit his shoulders. He looked uncomfortable but composed. "My son found this in an old album last night," Claire said. "Richard claimed he barely remembered your father. That photograph says otherwise." Annie picked it up carefully. She had never seen her father in that suit. He must have gone straight from work. Maybe borrowed the jacket. Maybe let Grace fix his tie in the hallway before he left. He stood apart from the men who were already deciding his worth, but he was there. Not invisible, not yet erased. Annie's thumb touched the corner of the photo. "He hated suits," she said quietly. "Said they made honest men look like they were applying for permission." Claire gave a sad breath. "He looks like he knew he didn't belong there." "No," Annie said. "He belonged anywhere truth was supposed to matter." The sentence stayed between them. When they left the coffee shop, Claire did not ask for forgiveness. She only said, "Tell your mother I am sorry, if she ever wants to hear it." Annie looked at her. "I'll tell her you're willing to testify. That matters more." Outside, Evelyn handed Annie the envelope. "This is important." Annie nodded, still holding the photograph. Her phone rang. "Grace," Annie answered. "Mama?" Grace's voice was steady, but tight. "There's a man outside the house." Annie stopped walking. "What man?" "He says he's from Whitmore's legal team. He won't leave. Mrs. Alvarez is on the porch with me, holding that skillet again." "But Annie." Grace's breath caught. "He has papers." Evelyn heard enough from Annie's face. "Give me the phone." Annie put it on speaker. Grace said, "He says if you don't stop releasing stolen documents, they'll file for damages. He said they can come after the house." Something in Annie went cold. Evelyn took the phone. "Mrs. Carter, listen carefully. Do not accept the papers. Do not open the door. Ask Mrs. Alvarez to call the sheriff's office and say an unwanted person is harassing a sick woman on private property. We're calling an attorney now." The line rustled. In the background, Mrs. Alvarez shouted, "I already called. And I hope he likes county bracelets." Grace gave a shaky laugh. Annie took the phone back. "Mama, I'm coming." "No," Grace said quickly. "Don't you dare give them what they want. They want you scared and running backward." "Mama?" "Annie Carter, listen to me. Your father stood still when they wanted him to move. You stand still too. I have Mrs. Alvarez, the sheriff, and the Lord. That is plenty for one afternoon. Despite everything, Evelyn smiled. Annie closed her eyes. Call me when he leaves. I will. Yes? Don't let them make you trade your father's name for my fear. The call ended. Annie stood on the sidewalk with Claire's envelope in one hand and Samuel's photograph in the other. The circle around Richard was shrinking, but his people still had long arms. Evelyn looked toward the traffic. Now they're desperate. Annie looked down at the picture of her father at the company dinner, standing alone but not bowed. No, she said. Now they're scared. And for the first time, fear was on the right side of the door. By the time the man from Whitmore's legal team left Grace Carter's porch, half the block had come outside. That was how small towns worked when they were at their best. A woman could spend years carrying grief behind curtains, but let one stranger in a suit stand too long at her door, and suddenly retired teachers, church deacons, mechanics, grandmothers, and one angry diner owner with a cast-iron skillet remembered they were neighbors. Mrs. Alvarez called Annie first. He's gone, she said, breathing hard. Deputy Wilkes made him take his papers and his shiny shoes back to whatever hole he climbed out of. Annie closed her eyes. She and Evelyn were sitting in Evelyn's car outside the coffee shop, Claire's envelope between them on the seat. Is my mother okay? She's sitting at my kitchen table drinking sweet tea and pretending she's not shaking. So no, she's not okay, but she's safe. Can I talk to her? She's in the bathroom putting water on her face. Let her keep a little pride, baby. Annie swallowed. Thank you, Mrs. Alvarez. That man asked if I was interfering with legal service. I told him I had been interfering with fools since 1978 and had no plans to retire. Despite herself, Annie laughed. Mrs. Alvarez's voice softened. Listen to me. Your mama is stronger than she looks, but she shouldn't have to be strong alone. None of you should have had to. I know. Then let people stand with you. Pride is good for posture. It is not a roof. After the call ended, Annie sat still with the phone in her lap. Evelyn did not start the car. Traffic moved past them in wet streaks, tires hissing over the street. Claire had gone to meet her attorney, leaving behind journal pages, voicemails, and a photograph that made Samuel's presence at Whitmore's table impossible to deny. Evelyn tapped the envelope. This gives us motive and knowledge. It gives us another person who waited too long. Yes, Evelyn said. It does. Annie looked at her. How am I supposed to carry all that? People keep handing me pieces of the truth, like I'm supposed to be grateful they finally stopped hiding them. You don't have to be grateful. Then what do I do? You use them. That answer was blunt enough to settle her. Annie leaned back and watched a bus pull to the curb. An older black man stepped down carefully, one hand on the rail, his lunch cooler hanging from the other. He wore a work jacket faded at the elbows. For a second, Annie imagined Samuel older, slower, coming home from a job he was allowed to keep. Her phone buzzed again. Grace. Mama? I'm all right, Grace said before Annie could ask. Mrs. Alvarez is feeding me like I'm the one who got arrested. You sure? I'm sure enough. Grace paused. The man was polite. That made it worse. Annie knew exactly what she meant. Cruelty with manners was still cruelty, but it made the victim look unreasonable for bleeding. He said they could come after the house, Grace continued. For damages, imagine that. They damaged this family down to the bone, then stood on my porch asking what we owed them. Evelyn's mouth tightened. I'm coming home, Annie said. No. Mama, no. You come home when this is done or when you need rest. Not because they rattled my window. I spent 6 years being afraid of that company. Today I saw Mrs. Alvarez threaten a lawyer with cookware, and Deputy Wilkes tell him to leave private property. Turns out fear looks smaller when it has witnesses. Annie wiped at her cheek. Grace's voice lowered. They're going to try worse, baby. I know. Then remember this. Your father didn't stand up because he knew he'd win. He stood up because he knew what would happen if nobody did. Annie gripped the phone. I miss him. I do too. Neither spoke for a moment. That silence did not feel empty. It felt shared. After the call, Evelyn drove them to the office of a civil rights attorney named Marcia Benton, a woman Evelyn knew from a labor case years earlier. Marcia was in her 60s, tall, with silver braids pulled back and reading glasses hanging from a chain. Her office was above a pharmacy in a historically black neighborhood, the kind of place where the walls held framed newspaper clippings, church banquet photos, and thank you cards from families who had needed someone with a law degree and a spine. Marcia listened without interrupting while Annie laid out the morning. The files, the recording, the witnesses, Claire's envelope, and the man on Grace's porch. Evelyn filled in legal details. When they finished, Marcia removed her glasses and set them on the desk. "First," she said, "nobody from Whitmore contacts your mother again except through counsel. I'll send notice today." Annie exhaled. "Second, you do not meet anyone alone. Not a reporter, not a lawyer, not a former employee, not a friend of a friend with something important. People with secrets often come wrapped in traps." Evelyn nodded. "That's what I told her." "Good. Third, this is bigger than clearing your father's name now. Use is billionaire. This is bed evidence tampering, witness intimidation, fraud, civil rights implications, labor safety violations, and wrongful reputational harm. That means everyone will want a piece of this story, including people who do not care about Samuel Carter." Annie looked down at her hands. "I care." Marcia's voice softened. "I know you do. That is why I'm telling you to protect yourself from people who care about the headline more." Annie lifted her eyes. "Can they come after my mother's house? They can threaten. Threats are cheap. Winning is different." Marcia leaned forward. "But fear is often the first lawsuit poor families lose. We won't give them that one." For the first time that day, Annie felt the floor under her steady. Marcia reviewed Claire's journal pages, the voicemail transcripts, Renee's notes, Thomas Bell's timeline, Calvin's statement, and Samuel's original report. She did not react dramatically. She marked pages with sticky notes, wrote questions in the margins, and built order out of chaos. "This," she said, tapping the voicemail where Richard mentioned Grace taking the money, "matters. It shows attitude. Maybe not enough alone, but with the recording, the altered timeline, and witness accounts, it helps establish a pattern." "What happens next?" Annie asked. "We request preservation orders. We cooperate with the Attorney General's inquiry. We prepare Grace in case she chooses to make a statement. But we do not let anyone pressure her. And you, Annie, decide what justice means before other people define it for you." Annie frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means money will come up. Settlement, scholarship fund, public apology, corrected records, maybe charges, maybe not. Powerful people like to offer pieces and call them whole. You need to know what cannot be negotiated." Annie answered without hesitation. "My father's name." Marcia nodded. "Good. Start there." As evening came on, Annie and Evelyn left the office with a folder of instructions and Marcia's direct number. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into dinner. A man swept the sidewalk in front of a barber shop. Two boys rode bikes past a church sign. Someone's grill smoked behind a row house. Ordinary life again, but this time Annie did not resent it. Ordinary life was what her father had tried to protect. Back at Evelyn's house, they found a message waiting from Paula Grant at Whitmore Development, requesting formal communication through counsel. Marcia had already copied Annie on the reply. "Do not contact Miss Carter or Mrs. Carter directly again." Annie read it twice. "That feels good," she admitted. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Boundaries often do." At 9, Channel 8 reported that Malcolm Pierce had retained personal counsel. By 9:30, 2 board members called for an emergency independent review. By 10, the governor's office announced it would return campaign donations connected to Whitmore Development, pending further investigation. Annie watched all of it from Evelyn's couch, wrapped in the same quilt from the guest room. She should have felt victory. Instead, she felt tired in places sleep would not reach. Evelyn set a mug of tea beside her. "You don't have to feel happy for it to be progress." Annie looked at Samuel's photograph on the coffee table. "My father would hate all this attention. He would love that you're telling the truth. He'd tell me to be respectful. He'd also tell Richard Whitmore his foundation was cracked." Annie smiled a little. Her phone buzzed one last time before she went to bed. A text from Grace. "Mrs. Alvarez says if Mr. Whitmore sends another man to the porch, she's charging rent." Annie laughed, then cried, then laughed again because grief had become too tangled to separate. She typed back, "Tell her I said thank you." Grace replied, "She says thank her by eating breakfast tomorrow." Annie held the phone to her chest. Outside, the cameras had finally left Evelyn's street. Inside, the house was quiet. But the silence was different now. Not the silence Richard had bought. Not the silence Grace had survived. Not the silence Evelyn had regretted. This silence had witnesses, lawyers, neighbors, nurses, workers, and one daughter who had finally learned she did not have to carry her father's name alone. By morning, Samuel Carter's name was no longer a footnote. It was on the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, beside a photograph from the Civic Tower site, and a timeline that made 6 years of official language look thin. It was spoken on morning radio by hosts who paused before saying negligent, as if the word had begun to taste wrong. It moved through barbershops, church offices, break rooms, union halls, diners and kitchens where older men leaned toward television screens and older women said, "I knew there was more to that story," even if they had not known Samuel personally. Annie read the article at Evelyn's kitchen table while toast cooled beside her plate. The headline did not call her father careless. It did not call him disgraced. It said, "New record show engineer warned Whitmore before Civic Tower collapse." She touched the paper once, then pulled her hand back. Evelyn noticed, "You all right?" "I keep waiting for the sentence where they turn on him. They might still try." "I know, but not in this article." Annie nodded. That was the strange part. A newspaper had printed her father's name and had not wounded him with it. Her phone rang before she could take a bite. Marcia Benton's name appeared on the screen. Annie answered, "Yes, ma'am." "Eat breakfast," Marcia said. Annie looked at Evelyn. "Does every woman over 60 have a meeting about this?" "Yes," Marcia said. "We hold it every Tuesday. Now listen, the Attorney General's office wants an initial statement from you this afternoon. Not a deposition yet. A voluntary interview. I'll be there. Evelyn can come. Your mother does not need to attend." Annie straightened. "What do they want to ask? How you obtain the materials, who has copies, what contact Whitmore or its representatives had with you or Grace, and what you know about the original report. Are they investigating Richard? They won't say it that plainly this early, but yes, the circle is moving in that direction." Annie looked down at the newspaper. Samuel's photo was smaller than Richard's, but it was there. "Will this clear my father's record? It can help. The engineering board has opened a formal review. That's separate from criminal or civil questions. We'll push both." "Push how hard?" "As hard as your father's name deserves." After the call, Annie made herself eat half the toast because Grace and Mrs. Alvarez had apparently formed a long-distance breakfast enforcement committee. Evelyn drove her to Marcia's office first, where they spent an hour reviewing dates. Annie did not like how legal truth had to be arranged in straight lines. Grief never happened that way. It came folded over itself. The day Samuel died sat beside the day Annie found the tin box, which sat beside the morning he tied her shoelaces on the porch and told her double knots saved time. But Marcia needed dates, names, copies, exact words. "When you don't remember, say you don't remember," Marcia told her. "Don't fill silence because you're nervous. Lawyers live in filled silence." Evelyn added, "So do guilty men." The Attorney General's regional office was not grand. Annie had expected stone columns, flags, something heavy. Instead, it was on the 6th floor of a government building with humming lights, gray carpet, and a receptionist who gave them visitor badges. The ordinary look of it calmed her. Justice, if it came, might not arrive with thunder. It might come through tired public employees, file folders, and a conference room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee. 2 investigators met them. Dana Mitchell, a black woman in her 40s, with close-cropped hair and a direct gaze, and Robert Klein, an older white man who wore reading glasses low on his nose. They shook hands with Annie carefully. Not pitying, not warm enough to feel false, Miss Mitchell began. "Miss Carter, I know the last 24 hours have been intense. We're going to ask questions, but you can take breaks." Annie nodded. "I don't need a break." Marcia touched her arm. "You can still take one." Annie almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." They started with the tin box. Annie told them about the money Richard's people sent after Samuel died, about Grace keeping it in the house but refusing to treat it as help, about the old documents Samuel had saved. She told them about Evelyn, the storage site, the recovered files, Calvin Brooks, Renee Talbot, Thomas Bell, and Claire Whitmore. When she reached the boardroom, her voice grew steadier. "Richard asked me how much more I wanted," she said. "He thought I came for money." Miss Mitchell looked up from her notes. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it was his filthy money." Klein paused his pen, not shocked, marking the phrase. Annie continued. "He said my father's negligence caused the accident. Then I played the recording." "And after the recording?" Mitchell asked. "He changed. Not sorry. Not then. More like angry that the past had learned to talk." Robert Klein glanced at Marcia, then back to Annie. "That's your impression?" "Yes, sir." "Fair enough." They played the recording again in the room. Annie had thought hearing it would get easier. It did not. Richard's voice filled the small government conference room, stripped of boardroom drama, stripped of money and glass and frightened executives. It sounded worse there. Cleaner. Less deniable. Make it look like his failure, not mine. Miss Mitchell stopped the audio. For the first time, her professional expression cracked slightly. "Your father's original report," she said, "recommended immediate work suspension?" "Yes." "And the altered file removed that recommendation?" "Yes." "Did your father ever tell you, as a child, that he had warned them?" Annie looked at Marcia. Marcia nodded. "He told me not to believe anyone who said he didn't care," Annie said. "I didn't understand then. I do now." The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. When it ended, Mitchell gave Annie her card. "This process may move slower than you want," she said. "It already moved 6 years too slow." Mitchell accepted that. "You're right." Outside the building, reporters were waiting across the plaza, but Marcia guided Annie through a side exit. Evelyn's car was parked near the curb. Before they got in, Annie's phone rang. Grace again. "How did it go?" Grace asked. "I told them everything." "Did they listen?" Annie thought of Dana Mitchell's face when the recording played. "Yes, I think they did," Grace breathed out. "Your father always said being heard was different from being allowed to speak." Annie leaned against the car. "Mama, did he know he was going to lose?" Grace was quiet long enough that Annie heard traffic passing behind her. "I think he knew the room was against him," Grace said. "But your father believed a room could be wrong. That was one of the things I loved about him." After the call, Annie sat in the back seat while Evelyn drove, and Marcia followed in her own car. Downtown Atlanta moved past the window. A crew was repairing a sidewalk near the courthouse. One man held a sign that said "slow." Another guided a concrete saw along a marked line. Annie watched them until they disappeared behind traffic. "Every job site looks different now," she said. Evelyn kept her eyes on the road. "How?" "I keep wondering who gets listened to." Evelyn did not answer quickly. "Usually the person with the most money. Until someone makes listening expensive." At Evelyn's house, a letter waited in the mail slot. No return name. Evelyn picked it up with 2 fingers and opened it at the kitchen table while Annie stood back. Inside was a photocopy of an old internal memo. No note, no signature, just 1 page. Marcia arrived as Evelyn was reading it aloud. "Post-incident communication strategy," Evelyn said. "Subject, Carter narrative." Annie's skin went cold. The memo listed phrases to use with reporters. Procedural oversight. Individual responsibility. Isolated failure. Full cooperation. Near the bottom, one sentence had been underlined by whoever sent it. Avoid discussion of prior written concerns unless directly confronted with authenticated copies. Marcia took the page and read it twice. "This means they knew there were prior written concerns." Evelyn nodded, and planned how not to mention them. Annie looked at the blank envelope. "Who sent it?" "Someone who is still scared," Marcia said. "But less scared than yesterday." That evening, the State Engineering Board announced it would hold an emergency session to consider whether Samuel Carter's disciplinary record should be reopened. The vote would be in 2 days. Annie called Grace with the news. This time her mother did not speak for a long moment. "Mama? I'm here," Grace whispered. "I was just thinking about his license card. He kept it in his wallet even after they suspended him. Said it was still his until the truth said otherwise." Annie sat down slowly. Grace continued. If they clear him, I want to bring it. Bring what? His license card. I still have it. Annie pressed the phone to her ear. Of course Grace had kept it. The money, the clippings, the license card, the grief. Her mother had lived in a museum of what the world refused to admit. Then we'll bring it together, Annie said. Across town, Richard Whitmore's attorneys were preparing for subpoenas. Malcolm Pierce had stopped answering calls from the company. Board members were distancing themselves through private statements. Reporters were digging through old donations, inspection waivers, and every city project Richard had touched. But in Evelyn's kitchen, none of that mattered as much as one small card in Grace Carter's drawer, waiting 6 years for the truth to catch up. That night Annie finally slept, not deeply, not peacefully, but without the tin box in her dreams. Somewhere beyond the fear, beyond the cameras, beyond Richard Whitmore's collapsing walls, a record was beginning to change. And for the first time, Samuel Carter's name was moving toward daylight under its own weight. 2 days later, Grace Carter returned to Atlanta with Samuel's license card wrapped in a handkerchief. Annie met her outside the State Engineering Board building just after 9 in the morning. Grace stepped out of Mrs. Alvarez's old Buick slowly, one hand on the doorframe, the other holding her purse tight against her ribs. She wore a navy dress Annie had not seen in years and a gray cardigan buttoned wrong at the top. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were clear. Mrs. Alvarez leaned across the driver's seat. I told her if anybody gives her trouble, I'm parking on the sidewalk. Grace sighed. You are not. I have lived a full life, Mrs. Alvarez said. Don't tempt me. For the first time in days, Annie laughed without it hurting. She helped her mother onto the curb. Grace touched her daughter's cheek, studying her the way mothers do when news cameras and legal words have made a child look older overnight. You eating? Grace asked. Yes, ma'am. Don't lie to a woman who packed your school lunches. I ate toast. That is not a meal. Evelyn, standing nearby with a folder in both hands, said, I tried. Grace looked at her. The two women had spoken by phone but had not met in person. For a moment, old pain moved between them. Evelyn seemed to shrink under it. Mrs. Carter, Evelyn said, I should have come to you long ago. Grace's hand tightened on Annie's arm. Yes, you should have. Evelyn nodded. I know. Grace looked at her a moment longer, then said, But you came to my daughter when it counted. I don't know yet what to do with that. So for today, we'll call it enough. Evelyn's eyes filled. Thank you. I didn't say forgiveness, Grace said. No, Mom. Good. I like people to hear the words I actually use. Annie almost smiled. That was Grace Carter, before grief had learned every room in her body. Not healed, not unchanged, but present. Inside, the hearing room was smaller than Annie expected. Rows of wooden chairs faced a raised table where 5 board members sat with nameplates and thick binders. A state flag stood in one corner. The air smelled of coffee, paper, and old carpet. Reporters lined the back wall. Marcia Benton stood near the front, speaking quietly with Dana Mitchell from the Attorney General's office. Samuel's case was third on the agenda. The first 2 matters involved licensing renewals and a contractor complaint. Annie barely heard them. Grace sat beside her with the handkerchief in her lap, her thumb moving over the folded cloth. Every few minutes, Annie looked down at it. When Samuel's name was called, Grace closed her eyes. Marcia stood first. She did not give a speech full of outrage. She built the record. Samuel Carter had filed a safety report before the Civic Tower collapse. The report had been received by Whitmore Development's project office. The version provided during the original investigation omitted key warnings. New witness statements supported Samuel's actions on site. Audio and video evidence appeared to show intentional efforts to shift blame. Then she placed Samuel's old license card on the table. Grace made a small sound but stayed seated. This card, Marcia said, was kept by his widow for 6 years after suspension, not because she denied the board's authority, but because Samuel Carter never accepted that a false record could define a true man. One of the board members, an older white engineer named Paul Hensley, adjusted his glasses and looked at Grace. Mrs. Carter, would you like to speak? Grace stood before Annie could help her. The room changed with her, not because she was loud, because she was not. People leaned in to hear. My husband believed in this board, Grace said. He believed rules mattered. He believed inspections mattered. He believed a signature meant something. When you suspended him, he didn't curse you in our house. He said, they were given the wrong file. That's what he said. Even then, he thought the truth had simply been misplaced. She looked down at the handkerchief on the table, now empty. But the truth wasn't misplaced. It was taken. And when it was taken, it took my husband with it piece by piece. His work, his sleep, his way of walking into a room. He would sit at our kitchen table with that license card in his hand like he was trying to remind himself who he had been before powerful men told the world otherwise. Annie stared at her mother. She had never heard Grace say this much in public. Grace's voice trembled once, then steadied. I am not asking you to bring him back. I know better than that. I am asking you not to leave his name in a place it never belonged. The room was silent when she sat. Annie reached for her hand. Grace let her. Calvin Brooks spoke next. He wore a button-down shirt and walked with a slight limp. He looked at Annie before facing the board. Samuel Carter told us not to go up, he said. I was there. I let fear keep me quiet. I won't dress it up. He did his job. I didn't do mine afterward. Renee Talbot followed, reading from her nurse's notes. Thomas Bell confirmed the inspection timeline had been changed after he submitted it. Evelyn spoke last among the witnesses, her voice low as she described relabeling Samuel's report under Malcolm's instruction. Board members asked questions: dates, times, document handling, chain of custody, whether Samuel had authority to halt a section of the job. Marcia answered what she could. Dana Mitchell confirmed the Attorney General's office had opened a formal inquiry into record tampering and witness interference. Richard Whitmore did not attend. His attorneys sent a letter urging the board to delay action until all evidence had been authenticated. The board chair read one paragraph into the record, then set the letter aside. Annie felt a small heat rise in her chest. Richard still wanted time. He had always wanted time when other people were the ones paying for it. After nearly 2 hours, the board recessed. In the hallway, reporters approached, but Marcia lifted a hand. Not now. Grace sat on a bench near the window, breathing carefully. Annie knelt in front of her. You okay? Grace looked at the closed hearing room door. I said more than I meant to. You said what he deserved. Grace touched Annie's hair. Your father would have been embarrassed by all this attention. He'd say the board had other work to do. He'd say that exactly. They both laughed softly. Across the hall, Calvin Brooks stood alone, twisting his cap in his hands. Annie walked over. He straightened as if reporting to someone. Mr. Brooks, she said. Annie, my mother heard you. His eyes lowered. I should have found her years ago. Yes. He nodded. But today mattered, Annie said. He looked up, surprised by the mercy in that sentence, small as it was. Thank you, he said. The board returned at 12:40. Everyone stood or settled back into chairs. The chairwoman, Denise Albright, read from a prepared statement. The board had reviewed the newly submitted evidence, witness testimony, original documentation, and the basis for Samuel Carter's suspension. Pending full procedural correction, the board voted to vacate the prior disciplinary finding and restore Samuel Carter's professional standing posthumously. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. Annie did not understand the words at first. Vacate. Restore. Posthumously. They sounded like legal furniture. Then Marcia leaned toward her and whispered, They cleared him. Grace bent forward as if something had gone out of her all at once. Annie wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Evelyn cried quietly behind them. Calvin Brooks took off his cap. The chairwoman continued. This board acknowledges that Mr. Carter's prior suspension was based on an incomplete and materially inaccurate record. The board further recognizes that Mr. Carter's original safety concerns appear to have been timely, relevant, and professionally appropriate. Professionally appropriate. Annie almost laughed at the smallness of the phrase. Her father had lost his life under the weight of a lie, and the state returned him in the language of minutes and motions. But it was official. It was on the record. It could be printed, filed, cited, preserved. Nobody could say the board had not spoken. Grace stood slowly. May I have his card? Marcia retrieved it from the clerk and placed it in Grace's hand. Grace held it like a communion wafer. Then she turned to Annie. Your daddy was right. she whispered. Annie's throat closed. I know. No, Grace said, tears running freely now. Now they know. Outside the building, reporters called questions, but this time Annie did not feel hunted by them. She stood beside her mother while Marcia gave a brief statement. Samuel Carter's record had been restored. The Carter family would continue cooperating with state investigators. They asked for privacy and accountability. A reporter asked Grace what she wanted to say to Richard Whitmore. Grace looked at Annie, then at the microphones. I want him to know, she said, that money can quiet a room for a while. It cannot quiet a grave forever. No one shouted after that. That evening, Richard watched the clip alone in his house. Grace Carter's words played twice before he muted the television. He sat in a room larger than the Carter home had ever been, surrounded by art he had bought and photographs of ceremonies where people had thanked him for generosity. On the coffee table lay a printed copy of the board's decision. Samuel Carter's name appeared in it again and again, no longer as the man at fault, but as the man who had warned them. Richard picked up the paper, then set it down. For the first time since Annie walked into his conference room, he did not think about stock price, lawsuits, or Malcolm Pierce. He thought about a license card in a widow's hand, and he understood, with a discomfort no attorney could soften, that Samuel Carter had begun to get back what Richard had taken. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough to make the theft visible. Across town, Annie and Grace returned to Evelyn's house. Mrs. Alvarez had sent a foil-covered pan of chicken and rice with instructions that truth-tellers still need supper. Grace ate 3 bites, then 4. Annie watched her mother lift the fork without shaking. Later, Grace placed Samuel's license card beside his photograph on Evelyn's mantel. For a long time, mother and daughter stood in front of it without speaking. Then Grace said, "He can rest a little better tonight." Annie looked at her father's face, at the small card, at the proof that the lie had lost one of its rooms. "So can we," she said. But even as she said it, her phone buzzed with a message from Marcia Benton. "Richard Whitmore wants to meet. Public setting. Through counsel. He says he is ready to talk." Annie read the words once, then again. Grace looked at her. "What is it?" Annie held the phone against her palm. "The man who bought our silence," she said, "wants to speak." Richard Whitmore chose the public library on Auburn Avenue. Marcia Benton approved the location because it had cameras, open reading rooms, and enough people nearby to make private intimidation difficult. Annie suspected Richard chose it because no one could accuse him of hiding in his tower. Evelyn said men like Richard always tried to manage symbolism once facts stopped obeying them. Grace did not come. When Annie told her about the meeting, Grace sat beside Samuel's license card for a long time, then said, "I don't need to hear his voice to know what he owes." "You sure?" "Yes. You go if you need to. But don't go looking for the apology you should have gotten 6 years ago. Late apologies sometimes come wearing good shoes." So Annie went with Marcia and Evelyn. She wore the same black coat she had worn into Whitmore Development. Not because she had nothing else, but because some clothes became part of a witness. In her pocket was Samuel's photograph. She did not bring the money. That was still on Richard's boardroom table, sealed now as evidence after Harold Finch insisted the room be photographed before anyone cleared it. Richard was already there when they arrived, sitting at a table in a side reading area where older men browsed newspapers and a mother helped her boy sound out words from a picture book. He had no entourage, no Malcolm, no communications director, only one attorney, a woman Annie did not recognize, who stood when Marcia approached. Richard stood too. He looked smaller without the conference room. Still wealthy, still controlled, but smaller. The blue suit was plain by his standards. His eyes were tired. For a second, Annie remembered him shouting that one phone call could have her arrested, and she almost turned around. Marcia touched her elbow. "You decide how long we stay." Annie nodded and sat. Richard waited until everyone was seated. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "I didn't agree for you," Annie said. "I agreed because my lawyer said whatever you say should be heard with witnesses." Richard looked down once. "That's fair." "No," Annie said. "It's careful." Fair would have been listening to my father. The attorney beside Richard shifted, but Richard lifted one hand slightly. "Let her speak." Annie studied him. "Don't do that." "Do what?" Act humble in a public library because the cameras are outside. A faint wince crossed his face. You're right to distrust me. I didn't ask for permission. Evelyn sat quietly, hands folded, but Annie could feel the old woman's attention on everything. Richard's hands, his attorney's folder, the distance to the nearest exit. Marcia placed a recorder on the table. This conversation is being recorded, she said. Mr. Whitmore's counsel has agreed. No settlement terms will be discussed today. No release, no non-disclosure, no private resolution. Richard's attorney nodded. Correct. Annie looked at Richard. Then talk. Richard inhaled slowly. The engineering board restored your father's record. They did. I watched your mother speak. Annie's jaw tightened. Careful. I know. He paused. I don't deserve to say her grief taught me something. No, you don't. He accepted that too. The acceptance annoyed Annie almost as much as denial would have. Part of her wanted him to fight so she could keep hating him cleanly. Richard folded his hands. I came here to say 3 things. First, I knew Samuel Carter had filed safety concerns before the collapse. I did not simply learn that this week. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Marcia leaned forward. Say that again clearly. Richard looked at the recorder. I knew, before the Civic Tower collapse, that Samuel Carter had raised formal safety concerns. Annie felt the words enter her body like cold water. Second, Richard continued, after the collapse, I allowed the company's legal team to frame the incident around his supposed negligence. I knew that characterization was not honest. His attorney stared at the table. Annie's voice came out low. Allowed? Richard looked at her. For once, he did not hide behind the softer word. I ordered it first. Malcolm Pierce carried it out. Others helped, but I ordered it. Evelyn's mouth tightened. Marcia wrote quickly. And third? Annie asked. Richard looked at her for a long moment. The money sent to your mother was never meant as care. It was meant as closure. For us. Not for her. Annie's fingers curled around the edge of her chair. In the children's section nearby, a little boy laughed at something his mother whispered. The sound was so ordinary it nearly split Annie open. She imagined Samuel sitting with her in a library, helping her choose books, telling her she could check out 3 but would try to sneak a 4th past Grace. That life had not been stolen in one blow. It had been taken through meetings, memos, signatures, and one man deciding a deadline mattered more than a name. Richard spoke again. I am sorry. Annie looked at him. There it was. The sentence people waited for. The sentence television liked. The sentence guilty men hoped could stand at the front of everything else and make the room stop asking. No, Annie said. Richard blinked. No? You don't get to put those words down like a period. His face tightened, but he stayed quiet. My mother needed that sentence when she sat alone after the funeral, Annie said. My father needed it before his heart got tired of carrying your lie. I needed it when I was 12 and kids at school asked if my daddy hurt people. You saying it now is not nothing, but it is not enough to be the end. Richard nodded slowly. Then tell me what is. You already know part of it. Public statement, under your name, not corporate language. You say Samuel Carter was right. You say you lied. You say the settlement was used to silence my mother. You release every Civic Tower record, not the ones your lawyers pick. His attorney spoke. There are legal limitations. Marcia cut in. There are procedures, not limitations. We can discuss production through the Attorney General's office. Annie continued. You fund an independent worker safety trust, not controlled by Whitmore Development, not named after you. It helps families who get buried by companies after job site accidents. It funds legal help, mental health care, and scholarships for kids of injured workers. Richard listened without interrupting. And Samuel's name? He asked. Annie's eyes did not leave his. That is not yours to use for reputation. I wasn't suggesting, yes you were, maybe not with your mouth yet, but men like you put names on buildings when you want people to stop asking what happened inside them. For the first time, Richard looked ashamed in a way that did not seem arranged. Annie took Samuel's photograph from her pocket and placed it on the table. Richard looked at it as if he had been sentenced to. This is not a brand, she said. This is my father. Richard's voice was quiet. What do you want done with his name? A plaque at Civic Tower. Plain words. No charity language. No dedication from you. It says he warned the company before the collapse and was wrongfully blamed. It says the record was corrected. It says his work protected others even when his employer did not protect him. Richard's attorney whispered something to him. He shook his head. "I'll do it," he said. Annie stared. "You'll agree now because you're cornered." "Yes," Richard said. The honesty stopped her. He continued. "And because I'm cornered by the truth, not by you. There's a difference. I spent years avoiding that corner." Annie leaned back. "Do you think this makes you brave?" "No." "Good." Richard looked at the photograph. "Your father came to my office once after the report disappeared. I refused to see him. My assistant told me he waited nearly an hour." Annie had not known that. Evelyn looked at her sharply. Marcia's pen paused. Richard's face seemed to age as he said it. "I told myself if it mattered, legal would handle it. That was the day I stopped being able to claim I didn't know." Annie felt anger rise again, hot and clean. "He came to you?" "Yes." "And you left him sitting outside?" "Yes." She stood. Marcia stood with her. Evelyn reached for her cane. Richard did not move. "I thought you should know." Annie almost laughed. "You thought wrong if you imagined that helped." "I didn't think it would help." "Then why say it?" "Because your father tried every door, including mine, and I closed it." Annie's eyes burned. She put Samuel's photograph back in her pocket with careful hands. "My father was not a problem at your door," she said. "He was your last chance." Richard lowered his head. This time Annie did leave. Marcia gathered the recorder. Evelyn looked at Richard once. Not with fear anymore, but with disgust sharpened by age. Outside the library, reporters waited across the street. Marcia guided Annie away from them toward the parking lot. Annie did not speak until they reached the car. "He waited an hour," she said. Evelyn opened the door but did not get in. "Yes, he must have come home after that." "Yes, he never told us." Marcia's voice softened. "Maybe he didn't want you to know he had been humiliated." Annie looked toward the library entrance where Richard still had not emerged. "No," she said. "He didn't want us to know he had begged the wrong man to do right." That evening, Richard Whitmore issued his statement. He stood alone at a plain podium. No company logo, no board members behind him. His voice was strained, but the words were clear. Samuel Carter was right. I knew he raised safety concerns before the Civic Tower collapse. I participated in concealing those concerns and allowing blame to fall on him. The payment sent to Grace Carter after his death was not justice. It was an attempt to purchase silence. I am responsible. The clip played on every station by nightfall. Grace watched it from Mrs. Alvarez's kitchen, Annie beside her. When Richard said Samuel was right, Grace gripped Annie's hand so hard it hurt. When he said, "I am responsible," Grace closed her eyes. After it ended, Mrs. Alvarez turned off the television. "Well," she said, "that man finally found a sentence worth saying." Grace did not laugh. She looked at Annie. "Do you feel better?" she asked. Annie thought about the library. About the hour Samuel had waited. About the apology arriving too late to feed him, defend him, or keep his heart from breaking. "No," she said, "but I feel less alone with the truth." Grace nodded. "Sometimes that's the first mercy." Across Atlanta, phones rang in law offices, newsrooms, union halls, and boardrooms. Richard's statement had not ended the story. It had made ending it quietly impossible, and for the first time since Samuel Carter died, the lie no longer had anyone powerful enough to protect it. The plaque was installed on a Saturday morning, under a sky so clear it made the glass of Civic Tower look almost innocent. For years, the building had stood at the edge of downtown Atlanta, as if nothing beneath it had ever been questioned. People walked past it with coffee, briefcases, strollers, lunch bags, and hard hats, never knowing that a man's name had been buried in its foundation as surely as steel and concrete. Now a small crowd gathered near the east entrance where the scaffold had once failed. Not a ribbon cutting, not a celebration, just witnesses. Grace Carter stood beside Annie with Samuel's license card in her purse, and one hand resting on her daughter's arm. She wore the navy dress again, this time with the cardigan buttoned correctly because Mrs. Alvarez had fixed it in the car and said, "Grief is one thing, crooked buttons are another." Evelyn Moore stood a few steps behind them with Calvin Brooks, Renee Talbot, Thomas Bell, and Marcia Benton. Calvin had brought his grown son. Renee had brought the little spiral notebook. not because anyone needed it now, but because she said some records deserved to see daylight. Harold Finch and Mrs. Caldwell came too. No cameras, no speeches. They stood near the back like people who understood that showing up did not erase failing to stand up sooner. Richard Whitmore was there, but not near the plaque. He stood across the walkway with his attorney, older somehow than he had looked at the library. Since his public statement, the company had changed faster than anyone expected. Malcolm Pierce had been indicted for evidence tampering and witness intimidation. The Attorney General's inquiry had widened into other Whitmore projects. 2 board members resigned. Richard stepped down as chairman before they could remove him, though the newspapers used softer language. Transition, accountability, restructuring. Annie had learned that powerful men were allowed to fall into pillows made of words, but Richard had signed every release Marcia demanded. The full Civic Tower record was public. The Worker Safety Trust had been established through an independent board, with no Whitmore name attached. The first scholarship fund would support children of injured construction workers, with priority for students from underrepresented communities pursuing engineering, inspection, or labor safety. Richard's money would fund it, but his name would not sit on it. That had been Annie's condition. "It's almost time," Marcia said quietly. Annie nodded. A city official stepped forward with a sheet of paper, but Grace raised one hand. "No speech," she said. The official blinked. "Mrs. Carter, we prepared a few remarks." Grace looked at him until he folded the paper. "Then prepare to keep them," Mrs. Alvarez muttered from behind her. A few people heard and smiled. Grace stepped toward the covered plaque. Annie moved with her. For a moment, mother and daughter stood close enough that their shoulders touched. Annie could feel Grace trembling, but it was not the old trembling, not the kind that came from panic in the night or a stranger at the door. This was the body making room for something too heavy to enter, all at once. "Ready?" Annie asked. Grace looked at the cloth covering the plaque. "No." Annie slipped her hand into her mother's. "Me neither," Grace breathed out. "Then let's do it anyway." Together, they pulled the cloth down. The plaque was simple bronze, set into stone beside the entrance. No corporate seal, no polished language about unfortunate events. Just the words Marcia, Annie, and Grace had fought for. Samuel Carter, engineer, father, truth-teller. He warned Whitmore Development of unsafe conditions before the Civic Tower collapse, and was wrongfully blamed after those warnings were concealed. His professional record was restored by the Georgia State Engineering Board. May every worker who raises a warning be heard before harm is done. Grace made a sound Annie had never heard from her before. Not a sob exactly. More like air returning to a room that had been closed too long. She reached out and touched Samuel's name. For 6 years, Grace had touched his name on old mail, medical forms, funeral papers, the suspended license card she kept hidden away. She had touched it as a widow, as a woman fighting memory, as a mother trying not to drown her child in grief. Now she touched it in public, in daylight, where anyone passing by would have to read what the lie had tried to erase. "He was right," Grace whispered. Annie stood beside her. "Yes, ma'am." "No," Grace said, still touching the plaque. "I know I said that before, but today it feels like the ground knows it too." Calvin Brooks removed his cap. Thomas Bell bowed his head. Renee Talbot wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Evelyn closed hers and whispered something Annie could not hear. After a while, Grace stepped back. Her face was wet, but she looked steadier than she had in years. Richard approached slowly. Marcia moved at once, but Annie shook her head. "It's all right." Richard stopped several feet away. He did not look at Grace first. He looked at the plaque, then at Samuel's name, then finally at the 2 women standing before it. "Mrs. Carter," he said. Grace did not answer. He accepted that. "Annie." She waited. "I won't ask for anything from you," he said. "Not forgiveness, not peace. I only wanted to say I will keep funding the trust as agreed, and I will cooperate with the investigation fully." Marcia said, "That cooperation is already legally required." Richard nodded. "I know." Annie studied him. He sounded different than he had in the boardroom. Smaller, but not in a way that made her pity him. more in the way a man sounds when the room has finally stopped bending toward his comfort. Grace looked at him then. "My husband came to your office." Richard lowered his eyes. "Yes. You left him waiting." "Yes." Grace's voice stayed calm. "I used to wonder what I would say if I ever stood in front of you. I thought I'd scream. I thought I'd ask you if you knew how many nights he sat at our table trying to prove to himself he wasn't crazy." Richard's face tightened. "But I don't want to give you those nights," Grace said. "They're mine. They're his. They belong to our daughter. You don't get to stand inside every room you damaged." Richard looked at her. "I understand." "No," Grace said. "You don't. But maybe someday you'll understand enough to stop doing harm when nobody is watching." Annie turned toward her mother, surprised by the strength in her voice. Richard nodded once. He looked at Annie. "Your father was a better man than I was willing to see," Annie answered. "He was a better man before you saw him, and after you looked away." There was nothing left for Richard to say. He stepped back. And this time, no one followed him with a camera. He was not the center of the morning. That was a kind of justice, too. The crowd thinned slowly. Some people touched the plaque before leaving. Others stood at a distance, reading it more than once. A young apprentice in a bright vest stopped on his way into the building and took off his hard hat. He looked at the words, then at Annie. "Was he your father?" he asked. "Yes," Annie said. The young man nodded. "Then thank you." Annie did not know how to answer. Grace did. "Do your job safe," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. Afterward, they drove not to a restaurant, not to a press office, but back to Mrs. Alvarez's house. There was fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, rice, sweet tea, and too many people in the kitchen. Calvin came by with his wife. Renee brought pound cake. Evelyn washed dishes even though Mrs. Alvarez told her guests were supposed to sit. And Evelyn said, "I'm not ready to be a guest everywhere." Grace ate a full plate. Annie noticed and said nothing. Some miracles were better left unannounced. Later, when the house quieted and evening settled over the porch, Annie sat outside with her mother. Crickets started in the grass. Down the street, someone's television played a baseball game through an open window. Grace held Samuel's license card in her lap. "What happens now?" Annie asked. Grace looked at the yard. "Tomorrow, I'll wake up and still miss him." Annie nodded. "But I won't wake up with the world calling him guilty," Grace said. "That's different." Annie leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, the way she had not done since she was a child. Grace kissed the top of her hair. "You carried too much." "So did you." "Yes," Grace said. "But maybe we can start putting some of it down." Across town, Civic Tower glowed in the last light. No longer clean of what had happened, but marked by it. People would pass the plaque. Some would stop. Some would read quickly and move on. Some worker, tired after a long shift, might stand there one day and remember that a warning ignored can cost lives, and a warning spoken can outlive the man who gave it. Annie closed her eyes and thought of Samuel's voice. Not from the recording this time, not trapped in anger or danger, but from their kitchen years ago. A building can stand for 100 years, Annie, but only if somebody is brave enough to say when the foundation is wrong. For a long time, she had believed her father's life ended with that wrong foundation. Now she understood something else. He had not been the crack. He had been the warning. And warnings, when finally heard, can save what is still standing. The lesson of Annie Carter's story is that truth may be delayed, buried, and mocked, but it does not disappear. Money can buy silence for a season, but it cannot restore a stolen name or heal a family wounded by lies. Samuel Carter's courage reminds us that doing the right thing is not always rewarded in time, but it still matters. Annie's fight shows that justice often begins when one person refuses to keep carrying another person's guilt. In the end, real power is not wealth, status, or influence. Real power is the courage to speak the truth when silence would be easier. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.